Valley City, North Dakota is a rural town of 7,000. It's home to Valley City State University, where 22-year-old Mindy Morgenstern is an education major in the fall of 2006. In this tight-knit community, Mindy knows everybody, and everybody knows Mindy.
My name is Liz Klenke. Mindy and I talked a lot through emails or Facebook, and Mindy always answered her phone calls.
But on the night of September 13th, 2006, no one can get a hold of Mindy.
Mindy was supposed to go out that night with her friends, Tony and Danielle. But she never responded, and they were like, why isn't she answering?
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message.
According to reports by the local press, that's when they decide to go check on her.
My name is Brittany Lewan, and in 2006, I was the rookie reporter at the Forum in Fargo. So Tony and Danielle get to her apartment, and Danielle stays in the car, and Tony went up the stairs to the apartment to look for her. And as she kind of touched the door, it was unlocked and open. And immediately, as she steps in, she sees Mindy's feet on the floor. And her head leaning toward the kitchen.
When she sees blood, Tony screams and calls 911. The commotion gets the attention of another tenant in the building.
There was a man who heard Tony understandably upset after seeing her friend's body there. So he came up to the door and kind of helped Tony to look at what was happening and to figure out what was going on.
Law enforcement is at the scene within minutes.
As soon as I entered the door, I realized it was a murder. My name is Dana Rostabaki. Back in 2006, I was a patrol officer for the Valley City Police Department. There was a belt that was around her neck, and the suspect took a knife and cut her throat. And there was a very strong chemical smell because Mindy's body had been doused in pine salt. It was a shock to see her in the condition that she was in.
Valley City Police want answers. Did anyone see anything suspicious? Did Mindy have any visitors? A boyfriend? Could someone who lives in the building be the culprit? Officers take statements from Mindy's neighbors, and the tragic news spreads fast.
I remember my mom called me and just being in disbelief, like, this is no way, this isn't real. In Valley City, everybody knows everybody. Who would do that?
Mindy Morgenstern was more than a little nervous when she arrived as a freshman at Valley City State. She grew up on a farm near the tiny village of New Salem, North Dakota, after being adopted from Columbia at the age of 1 with her sister April.
Mindy stood out in a rural community, but she was proud of where she came from.
For a farm girl like Mindy, going to Valley City State is like moving to the big city.
When she moved to Valley City, she was telling everybody to be safe, be careful. And we're like, Mindy, it's okay, like, we're safe here.
Mindy overcomes her trepidation and blossoms into a confident, outgoing young woman with a busy social life.
She became friends with so many people right away because her personality was very magnetic. My name is Ashley Wallace, and I am a childhood friend of Mindy Morgenstern.
Just as her new life in college takes off, Mindy receives devastating news when she's diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
It was obviously a life-altering diagnosis, but she did not let that get in her way. It didn't stop her.
Despite major health challenges, Mindy is resilient and the type of girl who stands up for the little guy.
Mindy was an education major. She loved kids. She was going to school to work with kids.
She was always finding ways to try and help the world and help others.
She is so loved and gives so much love. How could anyone want to hurt her?
It was bizarre for that to happen in Valley City, but also for it to happen to Mindy, who didn't really have a mean bone in her body.
Valley City police realize they can't handle a murder case alone. So they call in state investigators from nearby Fargo, who arrive 2 hours after the tragic discovery.
My name's John Byers. In 2006, I was an assistant attorney general working for the state attorney general for North Dakota. The state crime bureau was involved right from the very beginning.
And Fargo detectives are stunned by what they find at the scene.
Visible to the officers were one knife still in her neck and the other one kind of resting on her shoulder, both of which had a broken handle from whoever cut her throat. There were some freshly laundered clothes in a laundry basket. And so she might have been doing laundry.
Investigators try to piece together what may have happened to Mindy.
It looked as though Mindy was walking into her apartment. She still has her purse on her shoulder. She has her keys in her hand. And the perpetrator came up from behind her and used a cloth belt that strangled her and then plunged 2 knives into her neck.
It would seem to indicate that this was a very short encounter. The person that did this to Mindy got a bottle of Pine Sol and then proceeded to dump that on Mindy's face and some of the rest of her body. A lot of us believed it was to destroy evidence.
Right now, this would be the north wall of the bedroom.
It could have been a robbery, but the apartment looks untouched. And Mindy's wallet is on the floor. So is her phone. And it's buzzing with incoming calls and texts.
There was no way to know whether this was someone specifically focused on Mindy or somebody that might be out interested in doing other crimes.
The investigators have no idea who killed Mindy, but they quickly figure out when the murder took place.
She was pretty active on her phone, texting and calling with friends. She stopped answering any calls or texts at 12:47.
Her friends had found her at 9 o'clock. There was this 9-hour window of time, and people in her apartment actually helped them to narrow down the time frame for when she was killed because people smelled an odor of Pine Sol about 1:30 p.m.
Investigators now know Mindy was murdered within 45 minutes after her phone activity stopped. When detectives talk to Mindy's friend who discovered her body, they're very interested to learn that Mindy's neighbor was at the scene.
It might not have been a coincidence that he came to the assistance of Mindy's friend. Sometimes people that commit homicides hang around the area and watch to see what happens. This gentleman named Robert Linz came to Mindy's apartment and then told Mindy's friend, "I think she's dead."
When police look into Robert Linz's background, they become even more alarmed.
They realized he did have a felony criminal history. His past contributed to law enforcement's suspicion.
Investigators want to talk to Mindy's ex-con neighbor.
I understand that everybody's looking a little harder at me, probably do you.
Have you ever been involved in anything like that?
I concur.
During the interview, detectives pick up on something that raises a red flag.
The one thing that got everybody's attention is how he did have cuts on his hands.
All your hands are really cut up and stuff.
Yeah.
When Mindy's body was discovered, it looked like there was something under her fingernails.
Did Mindy scratch Robert Linz in a desperate attempt to fight him off? Or is it just a chilling coincidence? The truth is more disturbing than they can possibly imagine.
He had an obsession with Mindy.
It makes you sick to your stomach.
I was blown away.
Mindy Morgenstern was found stabbed to death in her apartment, but the small-town farm girl didn't go down without a fight. Investigators believe Mindy may have scratched her killer during the attack, and her neighbor, Robert Linz, has visible injuries.
Robert Linz appeared to have scratch marks around the hands.
Robert Linz fit the profile. He looked like the guy that we wanted to be able to capture and say, this is the person that killed Mindy Morgenstern. My name is Lee Grossman. In 2006, I was the Assistant State's Attorney for Barnes County in Valley City, North Dakota. Robert Linz served time in prison in California. He was new to Valley City.
I touched her arm and called her name Mindy. And then I got a closer look. And when I touched her arm, she was holding the step already.
Linz claims to be nothing more than a concerned neighbor, but police focus on the fresh scratches on his hands. Where did they come from?
I could feel all day. I did all day long, yeah.
He said the scratches from his arms came from the work that he did with his hands. Robert worked in a metal fabricating factory in Valley City. He said he clocked in that morning and he clocked out that afternoon, and he was here the whole time.
Robert Linz offered his DNA voluntarily, fingerprints, everything.
Police want more info about Linz. And it so happens that another one of Mindy's neighbors is a fellow law enforcement officer.
Mindy had remarked to people before that she felt very comfortable in the apartment that she lived in because there was also a correctional officer who lived in the building.
His name is Mo Gibbs, a respected community member and family man who works at the local jailhouse.
Mo was working the night shift at the correctional center during that time, so during the time of her murder, he would have been home.
Mo tells detectives he was in his apartment with his 15-month-old stepdaughter while his wife was at work.
He didn't notice anything unusual. He didn't recall seeing Robert Linz at that time. He did note that there was an odor of pine sol sometime that afternoon.
Other than the odor, none of Mindy's neighbors noticed anything strange that day. With only one suspect and little to go on, the investigators gather more information from people in Mindy's social circle.
I talked with the police, talked through Mindy's friends, Mindy's boyfriends. The time that Mindy passed away, Jordan was her boyfriend. Jordan was a local, and Mindy helped out at their farm that Jordan's parents owned.
Because of the nature of the crime, we wanted to find someone who would have had access to Mindy and her apartment during that time.
To be honest, Jordan never crossed my mind until the police asked me about Jordan. And then I was like, oh no, maybe. And Mindy never gave any inclination that Jordan even had that side to him.
Oftentimes with murders like this, it's from someone who acted in a fit of rage or in a fit of jealousy.
72 hours after Mindy's body was discovered, Jordan agrees to talk to investigators. He claims that the night before Mindy's murder, they had a quiet night at her apartment.
We rented a movie. We got home, we watched it. I went into the kitchen to throw like a bottle away or something. And I looked at the microwave clock because I wanted to know what time I'd get home. And I was tired, I wanted to get some sleep. I probably got home at about 1.
At the time Mindy was killed on the following day, Jordan says he was working on his family farm. But the detectives aren't so quick to believe his alibi. As the investigators dig further into Jordan and Mindy's romance, they learn from Mindy's friends that their relationship was less than perfect.
I think that Jordan would have wished that she was ready to settle down, but Mindy, her heart was kind of stuck yet with that relationship with Kyle.
Kyle is Mindy's ex, who broke up with her the year before.
Kyle was, at that time, the love of her life. Kyle graduated, moved away, and started his career. Mindy was heartbroken when her and Kyle broke up, but moved on.
According to Kyle, Mindy didn't move on. He tells police a few months before her murder, Mindy showed up to his apartment uninvited.
She goes, "You won't answer my messages, you won't call, you won't write back." She said, "I just want to talk to you." I said, I said, "I don't have anything to say to you." So finally she left crying. And that was actually the last time that I ever talked to her.
But Mindy is never completely out of his life because she's also very close to Kyle's family.
Mindy still talked to Kyle's dad. Awkward, weird. We used to tell Mindy that and be like, "Gosh, that's weird."
Weird for sure, but also a major source of tension between Kyle and his father.
I said, "I'd appreciate it if you just stopped talking to her." And your dad's name is? Rod.
You told Rod several times?
Yeah, yep. I said, because really, Dad, I said, it's even tearing our relationship apart. I said, it's like, I don't want you talking to her.
Despite the fact that Kyle and Mindy's relationship had ended, Rodney kept in contact with Mindy.
Like, "Why are you doing that?" You know? In true Mindy fashion, "Oh, it's fine. You know, he's super nice and he cares about me."
Is Rod just a concerned father figure? Or is there something sinister to this relationship?
We had found through Mindy's cell phone records that she and Rod communicated quite often.
He would make 8 to 10, 12 calls a day to Mindy.
The relationship could be innocent, but messages found on Mindy's phone make it sound anything but.
After Mindy had been murdered, he was still calling and leaving her messages.
"God, fix the beautiful flowers. I'm sorry that's happened that way. It happened to you. Oh, God, I'm gonna miss you. Bye."
The detectives add Rod to their growing list of persons of interest. And as more shocking evidence comes to light,
The DNA that's linked to a really violent rape that's unsolved.
paranoia grips a college town.
We were all scared.
It's been 4 days since the gruesome murder of college senior Mindy Morgenstern. Investigators have interviewed persons of interest, including her neighbor, her boyfriend Jordan, and her ex Kyle. It seems that Mindy was hung up on Kyle, but it's Kyle's dad Rodney who's hung up on Mindy.
"Mindy, this is Rod. I know what happened to you. I just love hearing your voice. Can't take it. I love you, kid."
It was highly suspicious to police that Rodney Kuzniak not only was calling Mindy while she was alive, he also called and left voicemails for her after she had died.
"Sweetie, I miss you. I love you. You're my inspiration. Please help me. Please help me, Mindy. I can't continue without you. Please help me. Some way, help me. Love you. Bye-bye."
Were Rod's messages inspired by grief or a guilty conscience?
Most of us did not know the obsessive nature that Rod had with Mindy.
Law enforcement wanted to know why the father of Mindy's ex-boyfriend would have been calling to leave this voicemail.
The investigators bring Rod in for questioning and press him on his unusual relationship with his son's ex-girlfriend.
I did call after I heard the fact and left a message on. I know it's really stupid to do that, but.
You call her cell phone?
After you found out she was deceased. It's really stupid to do, but I wanted her to pick up and
What did you tell her?
you'd have to listen to it. I don't know. It's very emotional.
Everyone needs to feel.
Rod insists their relationship was innocent, but he admits that his son and his wife told him to cut off contact with Mindy.
There's a lot of things I'm telling you guys here that my wife would probably divorce. Might be the issue if I know.
Police discovered that Rodney Kuznia actually would meet her for meals every now and then, and he'd also given her money on occasion.
Rod would have been capable of getting access to Mindy's apartment, being able to walk in with Mindy, and then committing this type of crime. But he said he was traveling with his wife during the time of death that we had pegged for Mindy.
Rod's behavior can't be ignored. Investigators ask for a DNA sample and follow up on his alibi. Stumped by so many intriguing persons of interest, detectives hope the medical examiner's report can shed some light on who killed Mindy.
The medical examiner was able to get DNA that had been removed from fingernail scrapings and clippings underneath Mindy's left hand.
Mindy had done everything she could to fight off her attacker. She was not able to save herself. But she reached up with her left hand and took a gouge of skin out of whoever had attacked her.
Nearly a week into the case, investigators get an update on Mindy's neighbor.
Mr. Linz had a couple of scratches on his hands. Now, he said, I'm a blue-collar worker and I'm in a job where I hurt my hands daily.
His employer was able to validate that he had been working at the time when Mindy was killed.
Police want to know, did a stranger ambush Mindy as she entered her apartment? Or was the killer someone she knew?
You cannot hide.
We're being asked by the police, who else was she hanging out with? But we really couldn't come up with an idea.
I remember sitting with Jordan on my front steps and trying to talk it out together. And I kept thinking, it's got to be somebody we don't know.
With the killer still on the loose, Valley City is on edge.
I mean, we were all scared. We locked our cars, we looked over our shoulder, didn't go anywhere really alone.
I felt like backed in a corner because the fear just paralyzes you. I couldn't function. I couldn't take a shower without being afraid because I was afraid somebody was on the other side of the curtain.
Without solid evidence against anyone close to Mindy, investigators wonder if she didn't know her killer after all. And it turns out, Mindy had recently filed a police report about a disturbing run-in with a strange man.
I remember my phone ringing, and it was Mindy, and she was crying hysterically, and she said, somebody tried to take me. And I said, what? And she's like, some guy pulled up in a car in front of our apartment building, and then he got out of the car and was coming at her. She really thought this person was trying to take her and put her in the vehicle. So we went to the police station to file a report on what had happened.
It was very close in time to when she was murdered, within a couple of weeks of the murder happening.
Was this strange man stalking Mindy? And did he come back and kill her?
Valley City is located on the interstate. Someone could have come into town, followed her to her apartment. This could have been someone who had experience in stalking women. They knew how to kill someone, and they knew how to hide that they were the killer.
All these thoughts come into your mind. Could it have been you? And is this person going to be coming after me now?
Like, who's out there? Maybe who's next?
A violent killer.
Mindy was scratching and fighting.
Caught by a college girl who refused to back down.
We have a match.
Dark is coming after you.
Investigators in Valley City, North Dakota are looking for Mindy Morgenstern's killer and wonder if it could be the person she reported. Could Valley City be the hunting grounds for a sick predator?
The public was worried because this person's still on the loose. Was it someone passing through? And we didn't have answers.
This man in the car created 1,000 phone calls and leads. But none of the leads really led anywhere because it was such a vague description where that could have been anybody.
While the mysterious man remains elusive, investigators retrace every potential suspect's alibi, starting with Mindy's boyfriend.
Jordan said at that time, in the middle of the afternoon on September 13th, that he was in a combine on the farm. We spoke with Jordan's dad, Bruce. Bruce confirmed that Jordan was out combining at that time.
They even did some trial runs to see if it was possible to get to Mindy's apartment and back out there by the time that people knew that he was back. And it was too far away for him to have done this and gotten back.
And what about Mindy's ex-boyfriend, Kyle?
Kyle was living in Fargo, which is about 60 miles away. He was working that afternoon. And so keeping Kyle as a suspect became a difficult task because his timeline didn't really fit with Mindy's time of death.
Investigators also get info about Kyle's dad.
Rod Kuznia had an obsession with Mindy and was fixated on her and looked like a good suspect.
What we learned was that Rod was traveling with his wife on September 13th, and he would have had no way to get away from his wife in order to commit this crime.
We really had no information. Everybody's still kind of scratching our heads.
5 days after her murder, detectives get DNA results from the tissue under Mindy's fingernails.
That DNA sample was put into what they call CODIS, which is a database of DNA out there. And the crime lab director called us and said, "We have a match."
But the problem is they don't have a match with a name attached to it. The DNA from underneath Mindy's fingernails linked to a really violent rape in Fargo from 2004 that's unsolved.
Law enforcement went and spoke with the victim and asked her to provide details of the person who committed the rape.
In speaking to the survivor, she described the man who assaulted her as a large, tall African-American individual.
None of the persons of interest detectives have interviewed so far meets the victim's description. But there is one person that everyone knows who does.
Strangely enough, the first person who I thought of, and I think, and everybody else did, we thought of Mo Gibbs. Just due to the simple fact he lived in the same building as Mindy Morgenstern.
Mo Gibbs is a local corrections officer who lives 1 floor below Mindy with his wife and stepdaughter.
Mo Gibbs worked in the Barnes County Jail. I would see Mo on a regular basis in court. He didn't stand out other than the fact that he was very friendly.
Is it possible that Mo Gibbs, the well-liked jailer and family man, could be Mindy's killer? For local cops, it's hard to believe.
Mo was easy to talk to, and to me, he didn't seem like the type that would do something like this. It wasn't that long ago that we were at a softball tournament, and he seemed his normal self.
Mo Gibbs voluntarily submitted a DNA sample when law enforcement came back from interviewing the Fargo rape victim.
Investigators don't want to jump to conclusions.
The only information that we had was that the assailant was a black male. Law enforcement interviewed roughly 20 men at that time, all of whom voluntarily submitted their own DNA samples.
And they ultimately did find a match.
DNA exposes a serial predator.
Several women come forward
and reveals a killer.
We were shocked.
Hiding in plain sight.
I couldn't believe it.
Mindy Morgenstern fought for her life, and her killer's DNA ended up under her fingernails. Now, 1 week after her murder, police finally have DNA results.
From everyone that were tested. And it matched Mo Gibbs.
I couldn't believe it at first because I had just seen Mo earlier that day when he had brought an inmate over for a court hearing. He was well liked. Nobody really had anything bad to say about Mo.
This isn't a stranger. It was a law enforcement official. Mo Gibbs was married to a woman who was a Valley City native. Mo Gibbs was somebody who a lot of people in the community knew.
Okay. Just have a chair.
Mo Gibbs cooperates with police because detectives have questions, especially about a scratch on Mo's left hand.
And somewhere along the line, Mindy scratched the person that attacked her. Do you have any fresh scratches on you or anything?
From Wednesday? No. From after Wednesday, yeah. This happened Thursday, this happened Friday.
We're in the bind here. Your DNA is matching what we found on her under her fingernails.
I don't know how my fingernail, my DNA was under her fingernail.
People lie, but DNA doesn't.
Plus, I'm going to let you in on something else here. The DNA that they match, that they brought up, it also matches the DNA that was found on a girl that was sexually assaulted 2 years ago in Fargo.
Okay.
As law enforcement kept telling Mo about the evidence that was against him, he would always deny that he was the killer.
You want to talk to me about it, Ralph?
There's nothing to talk about.
Okay. All right.
Mo can deny all he wants, but police have enough evidence to place him under arrest.
Please, Jan. Can I have your back? We have an arrest warrant for the murder of Mindy Morgenstern. There's your...
It was shocking to me that it was him. Everybody was blown away to find out that it was him.
The following day, the community gets another shock.
Mo Gibbs is arrested September 20th. On September 21st, several female inmates come forward and disclose that he has been sexually assaulting them while he was working as their jailer, including one woman at 6 a.m. the day that Mindy was killed.
Soon after this disturbing revelation, the press learns the alleged killer has not always gone by the name Mo Gibbs.
I've gotten a tip from an anonymous caller that his previous name was Glendale Morgan Jr. So I run his name, his original name, through the federal database, and sure enough, I get a hit. He had served 5.5 years for a drive-by shooting at a Seattle nightclub in 1992.
how exactly did a felon with a violent record slip through the cracks and get a job as a jailer in a small town?
It would later come to be that the sheriff would say that he didn't ask for the right background check to be completed, where they could have discovered that he had done time in federal prison. It's a horrible oversight that allowed him to work at this jail.
Prosecutors feel the pressure to put this guy away for good. But at the pretrial, the judge rules out any discussion of the Fargo rape or the sexual assaults in the jail. The jury will only hear evidence directly related to Mindy's murder.
We explained how the DNA ended up under Mindy's fingernails. We explained how the DNA profile matched Mo Gibbs.
But the jury remains divided over the DNA evidence.
We didn't lose. We just needed to start over.
At the second trial, prosecutors convinced the jury that Mo's DNA got under Mindy's fingernails because she was determined to fight off his vicious attack.
We, the jury duly impaneled, do find the defendant, Mo Gibbs, guilty.
It was like a weight had been lifted off of our shoulders.
Mo Gibbs was sentenced to the maximum that you can get in North Dakota, and that's life in prison without parole.
Mindy, she's small but mighty, right? She was tiny, but she fought.
By clawing him, Mindy, in just the brief time that she had before she lost her life, did one thing that was responsible for solving the murder.
Not only did she solve her case, she also solved the case of a young woman who was raped in Fargo and provided an opportunity for these sexual assault victims in the jail to speak out about what was happening to them and to put a stop to it.
She changed the future for other women, other victims that could have been.
Can I be better at being who I am?
Mindy Morgenstern never backed down, no matter what life threw at her. Once a timid farm girl from a tiny town, she overcame her social fears and was loved by everyone. She refused to give up on her dreams, even in the face of extremely difficult health issues. When she was attacked by a violent serial predator twice her size, it's no surprise that Mindy chose to fight. And in the end, it was her fighting spirit that caught her killer.
I feel that Mindy would want people to know bad things happen in life, but there's hope and good things can come out of bad things. Beauty from the ashes. I think she'd want people to know that.
The South Pacific Ocean holds secrets in its deep blue vastness, where the horizon seems to stretch infinitely into the sky, creating an illusion of absolute isolation and untouched serenity. To the outsider, American Samoa, an unincorporated territory of the United States, represents an idyllic paradise of lush volcanic peaks, coral reefs, and a traditional way of life that has survived the pressures of modernity for centuries. The capital, Pago Pago, sits nestled within a dramatic, collapse-prone volcanic crater that forms one of the deepest and most sheltered natural harbors in the world. It is a place where the rhythm of the tides, the warmth of the tropical sun, and the deeply entrenched customs of the indigenous people dictate the flow of daily existence. Yet, beneath the canopy of green mountains and behind the vibrant facade of island communal life, there exist dark corners where the law of the state struggles to penetrate and where silence can become a fatal cage. In January of 2017, the gaze of this isolated society was violently pulled away from its picturesque landscapes and forced inside a sterile, wooden courtroom in the urban heart of Pago Pago. A legal storm was brewing, one that would challenge the very moral fabric of the territory, expose the profound limitations of its judicial system, and leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of its people. This was not merely a trial about a broken law. It was a societal reckoning centered on a tragedy that occurred behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the community, but with consequences that would reverberate through every village and every clan across the island. The air inside the High Court of American Samoa during that first month of 2017 was heavy, thick with anticipation and an underlying current of collective grief and brewing fury. The citizens who gathered in the gallery, the legal professionals who adjusted their robes, and the reporters who prepared their notebooks were all acutely aware that they were witnessing a watershed moment in their territory's legal history. At the center of this legal vortex was a case of domestic violence so severe, so mercilessly brutal, that it had stripped away the life of a local woman, a wife, whose voice had been permanently silenced by the very man who had vowed to protect her. The victim, an indigenous woman living within the urbanized sectors of Pago Pago, had become the latest, and perhaps most tragic, symbol of a hidden epidemic that many on the island knew existed, but few dared to speak about openly. Her death was not the result of a sudden, freak accident, nor was it the work of an unknown intruder creeping through the tropical night. It was the direct consequence of a sustained, violent assault perpetrated by her husband, an indigenous man whose anger had manifested in a relentless physical onslaught. The details that began to emerge from the preliminary hearings painted a horrifying picture of her final hours, a narrative of confinement, terror, and an agonizingly prolonged extraction of life through physical trauma. For the prosecutors representing the government of American Samoa, the path forward seemed clear, defined by a moral imperative to seek the highest degree of justice possible for a life so cruelly taken. They entered the courtroom armed with forensic data, medical examiner reports, and the grim physical evidence of the assault, determined to convict the husband of murder. In their opening statements, they laid out a case that was meant to show a clear, undeniable line of causation between the husband's conscious decisions and the wife's ultimate demise. They argued that when a person inflicts a beating of that magnitude, using instruments of pain like a whip and utilizing overwhelming physical force over an extended duration, the intent to cause death, or at the very least, a total disregard for human life, is inherently present. The prosecution sought to convince the jury that this was a case of murder in its truest sense, an act of ultimate dominion where a perpetrator decides that their anger outweighs another human being's right to exist. They wanted a verdict that would send a definitive, unyielding message across the territory, that the home is not a lawless sanctuary where violence can be practiced with impunity, and that the life of a Samoan woman is invaluable under the eyes of the law. However, the defense table was preparing a narrative that would pivot away from the physical reality of the injuries and dive instead into the murky, complex waters of human psychology and emotional volatility. The husband, sitting beside his legal counsel, did not deny the physical acts that led to his wife's death. The evidence of his involvement was too overwhelming, the marks of his anger too deeply etched into the history of that fatal night. Instead, his defense team mounted a sophisticated and highly controversial strategy aimed at mitigating his legal culpability. They began to construct a narrative around the concepts of provocation, immense domestic stress, and a sudden, catastrophic loss of behavioral control. They argued that the husband had been pushed past his psychological breaking point by a severe, escalating family conflict, a situation so emotionally charged that it triggered a state of extreme emotional disturbance. According to this line of defense, the husband was not a cold-blooded killer who had calculated the destruction of his wife, but rather a man who had been consumed by a temporary madness, an uncontrollable rage that blinded his reason and dictated his movements without his conscious intent to kill. They maintained that his actions, while tragic and undeniably violent, did not possess the specific malice of forethought required to meet the legal definition of murder. This defense strategy struck a sensitive, raw nerve within the cultural framework of American Samoa, where family dynamics, honor, and interpersonal disputes are deeply intertwined with traditional structures. by reframing a fatal act of domestic violence as a psychological tragedy born out of a severe family conflict. The defense was subtly appealing to a shared cultural understanding of how deeply domestic pressures can run within tightly knit communal societies. It was a calculated gamble, one that sought to shift the jury's focus from the suffering of the victim to the internal turmoil of the perpetrator. As the trial progressed through January 2017, the courtroom became a theater of intense philosophical and legal debate over the nature of intent, the boundaries of human self-control, and the degree to which external emotional pressures can excuse or lessen the punishment for a lethal act. The public watched with bated breath, realizing that the outcome of this trial would define how their society valued the life of a domestic abuse victim when weighed against the psychological excuses of her abuser. The climax of this legal battle arrived when the BOI Tamdone, the jury composed of local citizens from the community, retired to deliberate on the fate of the husband. The tension in the urban center of Pago Pago was palpable during those hours of waiting as people debated the merits of the case in storefronts, family enclosures, and along the harbor docks. When the jury returned to the courtroom to deliver their verdict, the announcement sent shockwaves through the territory and instantly ignited a firestorm of controversy that would cross ocean borders. The jury announced that they had found the husband not guilty of murder. They had chosen to accept, at least in part, the arguments put forward by the defense, concluding that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the husband possessed the explicit, malicious intent to end his wife's life during that chaotic, rage-fueled encounter. Instead, the jury convicted the husband on the significantly lesser charge of aggravated assault. The reaction to the verdict was immediate, polarizing, and deeply emotional. For the family of the victim, for the prosecution, and for advocacy groups dedicated to combating domestic abuse, the decision felt like a betrayal of the highest order, a judicial declaration that a woman's life could be taken through brutal violence, and yet the perpetrator could escape the ultimate consequences of a murder conviction. The distinction between murder and aggravated assault in the legal code of American Samoa was vast, not just in philosophical terms, but in the practical reality of the sentencing guidelines. A murder conviction could carry a sentence of life imprisonment, a permanent removal of the offender from the society they had harmed. An aggravated assault conviction, by contrast, offered a far shorter term of incarceration, raising the painful prospect that the husband would one day walk free, having served a sentence that many felt did not reflect the gravity of a lost human life. The verdict was viewed by many as a dangerous precedent, a sign that the legal system could be swayed by psychological justifications to minimize the severity of lethal domestic abuse. This controversial outcome did not fade away into the archives of the High Court. Instead, it became a catalyst for an unprecedented societal awakening within American Samoa. The January 2017 verdict bared to the world, and to the islanders themselves, a troubling vulnerability within their legal and cultural ecosystem. It forced an uncomfortable conversation about the ways in which traditional structures, such as the Matai system of family clans, which emphasize collective harmony, family hierarchy, and internal dispute resolution, could sometimes create an environment where individual victims of domestic violence are pressured into silence, and where perpetrators are shielded from the full force of statutory law. The case became a rallying cry for reform, mobilizing women's rights organizations, legal advocates, and ordinary citizens who demanded that the definition of domestic violence be overhauled, that legal loopholes allowing for the mitigation of fatal abuse be closed, and that the justice system prioritize the protection of the vulnerable over the preservation of patriarchal or psychological defenses. As we begin to peel back the layers of this profound case, we must look beyond the sterile language of the indictments and into the heart of a community wrestling with its own identity, its laws, and the tragic price paid by a wife whose final cry for help was answered only by the cold reality of a courtroom floor. To understand the profound tragedy of the woman whose life was violently extinguished in January of 2017, one must first understand the intricate, deeply woven fabric of the world she inhabited. We cannot speak her name, nor can we trace the exact steps of her childhood or list the mundane details of her daily routines, because the records provided to us strip away those personal identifiers, leaving behind a stark, devastating silhouette. She is recorded in the annals of the High Court of American Samoa simply as the wife, the victim, the woman who did not survive the walls of her own home. Yet, to view her merely as a nameless casualty in a legal document is to do a profound disservice to her memory. By examining the geographical, cultural, and societal ecosystem of the urban area of Pago Pago where she lived and died, we can begin to paint a deeply resonant portrait of the invisible cages that constrain so many individuals living at the intersection of modern law and ancient tradition. Her story is fundamentally intertwined with the land she walked upon and the centuries-old customs that governed her community, a complex backdrop that inevitably shaped the course of her life and the horrific circumstances of her death. Pago Pago is a place defined by breathtaking natural beauty and a unique geopolitical identity. Situated on the island of Tutuila, it serves as the territorial capital of American Samoa, possessing a harbor that cuts deeply into the volcanic rock, shielding the urban center from the wildest tempests of the vast Pacific Ocean. The urbanized sectors of Pago Pago present a fascinating, often disorienting juxtaposition. Along the main thoroughfares, one can see the trappings of a modern American territory, with commercial businesses, government administrative buildings, and the rhythmic flow of vehicular traffic. It is a place connected to the broader globalized world through shipping lanes and telecommunications. However, this veneer of contemporary urban life rests precariously upon a foundational bedrock of Polynesian tradition that is older, deeper, and ultimately more powerful in dictating the daily interactions of its people. The woman at the center of our narrative lived within this duality. She navigated the paved roads and the modern economy of the urban center, but her social reality, her marital expectations, and her position within the community were largely dictated by a traditional framework that has resisted the erosion of time. At the very heart of this traditional framework is the Matai system, the complex structure of family clans and chiefly titles that serves as the true organizing principle of Samoan society. The Matai system is not merely a ceremonial relic of the past. It is a living, breathing socio-political institution that governs land ownership, dispute resolution, and the overarching hierarchy of the extended family unit. In American Samoa, loyalty to the family clan, or AIGA, often supersedes individual autonomy. The collective honor, reputation, and harmony of the clan are fiercely protected, and the Matai, the chief, acts as the ultimate patriarch and arbiter of family affairs. For a woman marrying into or living within this system, her identity is inextricably linked to her family's standing. The pressure to maintain outward harmony and to protect the family from public shame is immense. While the Matai system provides a profound sense of belonging, mutual support, and cultural continuity, it also possesses a dark, oppressive shadow when it comes to matters of domestic abuse. The inherent demand for internal family cohesion often creates an impenetrable wall of silence around the suffering of individuals within the home. The victim in this case existed squarely within the crosshairs of this cultural phenomenon. As a wife, she was expected to be a pillar of stability within her household, upholding the dignity of her husband and the broader extended family. When the dynamics within her marriage began to fracture, and when the shadow of extreme physical violence entered her home, she found herself navigating a labyrinth of cultural barriers that are uniquely terrifying. In a society where family matters are expected to be resolved internally, seeking outside help from law enforcement or modern social services is frequently viewed as a betrayal of the clan, an airing of dirty laundry that brings profound shame upon the entire family structure. The traditional mechanism for resolving disputes, known as ifoga, involves a ceremonial apology and the giving of gifts to restore peace between families. While deeply moving and effective for certain transgressions, this system is fundamentally ill-equipped to handle the chronic, escalating nature of brutal domestic violence. It prioritizes the restoration of communal harmony over the immediate physical safety and individual justice of the battered spouse. Therefore, we must envision the profound isolation this woman experienced in the days, weeks, or perhaps years leading up to her death in 2017. She lived in a densely populated urban area, surrounded by neighbors, extended family members, and the bustling life of Pago Pago, yet she was entirely alone in her suffering. The systemic architecture of her community inadvertently functioned as an acoustic dampener for her cries for help. The deep-seated cultural pressures dictated that she endure, that she manage the volatility of her indigenous husband, and that she keep the violent reality of her marriage hidden from the public eye. This is the tragic paradox of her existence. The very social structures designed to foster community, ensure mutual protection, and celebrate family lineage became the silent accomplices to her entrapment. The fear of ostracization, the dread of bringing dishonor to her family name, and the pervasive societal minimization of spousal abuse formed a psychological prison long before the fatal physical blows were ever struck. The data surrounding this case highlights a severe, chronic issue within the territory, describing domestic violence as a deeply rooted problem that is frequently minimized or deliberately hidden behind the walls of the great family clans. The victim was not just fighting her husband, she was fighting a deeply ingrained societal apathy. Within this context, the violence she endured was not an isolated anomaly, but rather the most extreme manifestation of a power dynamic that often goes unquestioned. When a society places the preservation of the family unit and the authority of traditional hierarchies above the inviolable right to physical safety, it creates a dangerous vulnerability. For the wife in Pago Pago, this vulnerability was fatal. Her home, which should have been a sanctuary, was transformed into a theater of unrelenting cruelty while the outside world carried on, blinded by the dictates of cultural privacy. This environment of secrecy and minimized accountability emboldens perpetrators. The indigenous husband in this case, operating within a society that often looks the other way when it comes to the discipline or control of a spouse, likely felt a sense of impunity. The eventual defense strategy employed at trial, which framed his murderous actions as a tragic loss of control stemming from marital discord, subtly preyed upon these exact cultural sympathies. It relied on a shared, unspoken understanding among the community that family conflicts can be intensely volatile, thereby attempting to normalize an abnormal, horrific level of violence. The victim's perspective, her prolonged suffering, and her right to live free from torture were systematically overshadowed by the narrative of the husband's emotional state and the broader cultural reluctance to intervene in domestic matters. As we reflect on the portrait of this woman, we must recognize her immense silent endurance. She represents countless others who walk the streets of Pago Pago, balancing the demands of modern employment and daily survival with the heavy, often crushing expectations of traditional clan life. Her death exposed the fatal flaws in this delicate balancing act. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that when modern territorial laws designed to protect individuals fail to penetrate the customary shields of family privacy, the consequences are measured in human lives. The urban setting of Pago Pago, with its spectacular harbor and vibrant community life, was the stage upon which this tragedy unfolded, but the true setting was the invisible, suffocating space created by cultural barriers. The victim's story is a harrowing testament to the fatal cost of silence, a stark reminder that true justice cannot exist in a society that requires its most vulnerable members to sacrifice their safety on the altar of traditional family honor. When night falls over the volcanic crater of Pago Pago, the ambient sounds of the urban center gradually give way to the rhythmic, ancient cadence of the Pacific Ocean tide pulling against the harbor walls. It is a time when the tropical heat begins to dissipate and the dense, vibrant life of the island retreats behind the closed doors of family homes. In the idyllic imagination of the outside world, these homes are sanctuaries of communal harmony and deep-rooted tradition. However, on the specific night in question in early 2017, one such home in the urban sector transformed into a closed-door theater of unimaginable horror. The narrative of what transpired within those walls is not reconstructed from eyewitness accounts of neighbors or the desperate cries of a rescue, for the cultural mandate of privacy held firm, acting as an impenetrable acoustic seal. Instead, the sequence of events is pieced together from the grim, undeniable language of forensic pathology, the subsequent admissions in the courtroom, and the stark, physical evidence left behind in the wake of a catastrophic explosion of domestic violence. The conflict that precipitated the fatal assault did not emerge from a void. Trial records and the eventual defense strategy point to a marital relationship that had reached an absolute apex of tension, a domestic dispute that had festered and intensified until it breached the fragile levees of self-restraint. What began as a disagreement, the specific contours of which are lost to the overarching tragedy, rapidly accelerated past the boundaries of verbal altercation and entered a realm of profound, lethal physicality. To understand the sheer magnitude of the incident, one must confront the specific nature of the violence inflicted upon the wife. This was not a fleeting moment of lost temper, a tragic but instantaneous accident resulting from a single, unfortunate strike. The evidence gathered from the scene and the subsequent medical examination detailed a sustained, merciless campaign of physical devastation that far exceeded any common definition of a domestic scuffle. The weapon utilized in this brutal subjugation was a whip, an instrument that inherently demands distance, leverage, and a conscious, repetitive exertion of force to be effective. The introduction of a whip into a domestic space profoundly alters the dynamic of an assault. It shifts the violence from a chaotic, close-quarters struggle to a methodical, punishing imposition of absolute dominance. Every strike requires a deliberate wind-up, the violent acceleration of the material through the air, and the agonizing impact upon human tissue, followed by the retraction of the weapon to begin the cycle anew. The physical stamina required by the husband to maintain such a relentless barrage speaks volumes about the depth of his rage and the terrifying duration of the ordeal. He later claimed to be operating under an extreme emotional disturbance, a blinding psychological storm that stripped him of his reason. Yet, the physical mechanics of the assault required an ongoing, active participation in the act of destruction, a horrifying persistence that kept him swinging long after the initial threshold of injury had been crossed. For the victim, the reality of those moments defies adequate description. Trapped within the confines of her own residence, she was subjected to a level of physical agony and psychological terror that is difficult to comprehend. The home, designed to be a place of safety and familial warmth, became an inescapable cage where her physical integrity was systematically dismantled. The terror of the assault was undoubtedly compounded by the agonizing awareness of her isolation. Even in an urban environment, the deeply ingrained societal norms surrounding the sanctity of the family unit and the reluctance to interfere in the affairs of a husband and wife meant that her suffering was contained. Whether her cries were muffled by the architecture or simply ignored by a community conditioned to look away from domestic strife, the tragic result was the same. She was entirely alone, left to endure a torrential downpour of violence from the person who held the primary social authority within her household. As the assault continued, the psychological trauma of betrayal must have mirrored the catastrophic physical damage being inflicted upon her body. The sheer terror of realizing that the violence is not stopping, that the person administering the pain has abandoned all recognizable human empathy, is a profound psychological torture that preceded the ultimate failure of her physical form. The human body is remarkably resilient, capable of enduring significant trauma and initiating complex biological responses to protect vital organs and sustain life. However, there is a definitive threshold at which the sheer accumulation of physical damage overwhelms these defensive mechanisms. The relentless strikes from the whip and the accompanying brute physical force inflicted a compounding matrix of injuries. The medical reality of such an assault involves profound soft tissue damage, massive internal hemorrhaging, and the catastrophic disruption of the circulatory and nervous systems. Each successive blow exacerbated the trauma, sending waves of shock through her system. The body, under such a sustained and overwhelming attack, eventually begins a process of systemic failure. Blood loss, extreme physiological shock, and the failure of vital organs to compensate for the massive trauma lead to a rapid deterioration of vital signs. The medical examiner's findings would later confirm that the cause of death was directly linked to the severity and multiplicity of these injuries. The victim did not merely expire from a singular, fatal wound. Her life was slowly, agonizingly extracted from her through a protracted process of physical obliteration. The boundary between life and death was crossed not in a peaceful transition, but through a chaotic, violent exhaustion of her body's capacity to survive. When the final blow was struck and the husband's physical exertion finally ceased, a heavy, stagnant silence would have descended upon the room. This sudden cessation of noise, the abrupt end to the sound of the whip, the violent impacts, and the desperate struggle for survival, marks the most chilling transition in the narrative of the crime. The violent frenzy, whether categorized as an extreme emotional disturbance or a sustained act of malicious intent, suddenly evaporated, leaving behind the cold, immutable reality of the consequences. The husband stood in the immediate aftermath of his own making, transitioning from the role of an active aggressor to a solitary witness of his own destructive power. The room, previously charged with terrifying kinetic energy and kinetic rage, was now a static crime scene. The profound stillness of the victim's body stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the frantic violence of the preceding minutes or hours. In this isolated space, before the intervention of paramedics, before the arrival of police tape, and before the formulation of any legal defense strategy, the raw, unfiltered truth of the incident existed in absolute clarity. A human life had been forcibly and brutally terminated. The passage of time in the immediate wake of such an event often warps, becoming simultaneously elongated and compressed. The husband was left to navigate the immediate shock of the outcome, the adrenaline of the assault slowly giving way to the monumental gravity of the situation. The defense would later heavily rely on his psychological state during this precise window, arguing that his actions were the result of a mind untethered from rational thought by the sheer weight of domestic pressure. Yet, regardless of his internal monologue or emotional fragmentation in those silent hours, the physical evidence surrounding him offered an objective, unyielding counter-narrative. The blood, the positioning of the body, and the scattered remnants of the struggle provided a silent, irrefutable testimony to the brutality that had just occurred. Outside the walls of the home, the territory of American Samoa remained oblivious to the tragedy. The harbor waters continued to gently lap against the shore, the tropical flora swayed in the night breeze, and the community slept, entirely unaware that the delicate social fabric of their society had just been violently torn. As the deep night slowly transitioned into the early hours of the morning, the stark contrast between the internal horror and the external beauty of the island became increasingly pronounced. The rising sun, which typically brings the promise of a new day and the resumption of communal life in Pago Pago, instead illuminated a scene of profound devastation. The inevitable moment approached when the private nightmare would have to intersect with the public sphere. The husband, faced with the undeniable reality of his wife's deceased body, was forced to initiate the sequence of events that would bring the outside world into his home. The exact nature of this initiation, whether driven by a sudden realization of the finality of his actions, a residual sense of panic, or a calculated first step towards self-preservation, marked the end of the incident itself and the beginning of the legal and societal reckoning. The calls were made, the authorities were alerted, and the protective, silent walls of the domestic space were finally breached by the flashing lights of emergency responders and the methodical, clinical gaze of law enforcement. The paramedics and police officers who first crossed the threshold of that residence stepped into a microenvironment saturated with violence. Their immediate assessments and the securing of the premises were the first steps in translating the chaotic, bloody reality of the night into the structured, sanitized language of a criminal investigation. They were tasked with documenting the aftermath of a storm that had already passed, gathering the shattered pieces of a life to present before a court of law. As the victim's body was carefully removed from the home, beginning its journey to the coroner's office, the true scope of the tragedy began to solidify. The incident was no longer a hidden, desperate struggle in the dark. It was now a matter of public record, a profound challenge to the justice system, and a deeply painful wound upon the conscience of the territory. The fatal assault was complete, but the shockwaves generated by those agonizing hours in Pago Pago were only just beginning to radiate outward, destined to test the boundaries of the law, the strength of the community's traditions, and the very definition of justice in American Samoa. The transition from the immediate aftermath of the fatal assault to the formal commencement of the criminal investigation marks a critical threshold in the pursuit of justice, shifting the tragedy from a private nightmare into a rigorous public inquiry. When the authorities first breached the threshold of the residence situated in the densely populated urban sector of Pago Pago, they stepped out of the warm, tranquil reality of the South Pacific morning and into a chilling, hermetically sealed environment of absolute devastation. The initial response by law enforcement was dictated by strict procedural protocol, a necessary compartmentalization of human empathy required to preserve the fragile integrity of the crime scene. The patrol officers and detectives who arrived were confronted with a visual reality that immediately contradicted any preliminary assumptions of a standard, routine domestic disturbance. The sheer volume and distribution of physical evidence within the home spoke a silent but deafening language of prolonged, extreme violence. The process of securing the perimeter was paramount, ensuring that the ecosystem of evidence remained uncontaminated by the outside world, shielding it from curious onlookers and the deep-seated cultural instinct to internalize family tragedies. Crime scene technicians began the slow, methodical work of documenting the spatial dimensions of the assault, treating every surface, every displaced piece of furniture, and every shadow cast upon the walls as a potential repository of objective truth. Through the dispassionate lens of their forensic cameras, the tragic final hours of the victim were captured in stark, high-resolution clarity. They mapped the trajectory of the struggle, noting the areas of the highest concentration of physical disruption, which indicated where the violence had been most intense and prolonged. The most crucial element recovered from this agonizing reconstruction was the primary instrument of the assault itself, the whip that had been utilized with such devastating repetition. The physical attributes of this weapon, its material composition, its weight, its length, and the grim biological evidence it retained, were meticulously catalogued and sealed within evidence bags. This was no longer just an inanimate object found within a home. It was the physical manifestation of the husband's kinetic rage, a critical, tangible piece of the puzzle that would eventually anchor the government's assertion of malicious, sustained intent. While the crime scene investigators painstakingly reconstructed the geography of the assault, the most profound and sorrowful phase of the investigation shifted away from the residence and into the sterile, brightly lit, and highly controlled environment of the medical examiner's facility. Here, the victim, violently stripped of her identity as a wife, a community member, and a living human being, became the primary, albeit silent, witness to her own demise. The autopsy is a fundamentally clinical procedure, an unyielding and necessary search for physiological truth that requires the stripping away of all emotional context and cultural narrative. The medical examiner's mandate was to translate the chaotic, brutal violence inflicted upon the victim's body into a precise, legally binding lexicon of trauma, pathology, and causation. As the examination proceeded over several agonizing hours, the true, horrifying scale of the husband's actions was laid bare under the surgical lights. The forensic pathologist documented an extensive, overlapping matrix of injuries that painted an undeniable picture of unrelenting physical punishment. The clinical documentation focused not on a singular, tragic anomaly, such as a bad fall or a single, unexpectedly fatal strike, but on a cumulative, systematic destruction of human tissue and bone. The profound soft tissue damage, the deep lacerations, the massive internal hemorrhaging, and the severe shock to the nervous system correlated directly and irrefutably with the repeated, forceful application of the whip and blunt force trauma. The medical examiner was tasked with meticulously charting the timeline of physiological failure, demonstrating for the official record exactly how the sheer volume of pain and physical damage overwhelmed the victim's biological capacity to sustain vital cellular functions. The final autopsy report concluded with devastating finality that the exact mechanism of death was inextricably linked to this sustained, overwhelming trauma. This conclusion was not a matter of subjective interpretation or cultural perspective. It was an undeniable, scientific fact that solidified the causal bridge between the husband's violent physical exertion and the permanent cessation of the wife's life, providing the prosecution with the unshakable bedrock upon which they would build their formal charge of murder. Parallel to the exhaustive forensic and medical investigations, the lead detectives tasked with interrogating the husband were navigating a complex, perilous psychological landscape within the concrete walls of the police precinct. The interrogation room is deliberately designed to be a vacuum, a space completely devoid of the cultural influences, familial pressures, and societal standing that dictate life outside on the island, forcing the suspect to confront the raw reality of their actions in profound isolation. The investigators approached the husband not merely to secure a mechanical confession of the physical act, because the forensic evidence tying him to the scene and the weapon was already overwhelmingly apparent and virtually impossible to contest. Their primary objective was to probe the darker, more elusive, and legally critical element of criminal intent. The law demands an understanding of the internal mind that directed the violent hands. During these crucial, tense hours of questioning, a pivotal shift occurred that would ultimately define the entire trajectory of the upcoming legal battle. The husband, guided by his legal counsel, did not attempt to construct a fragile alibi, nor did he deny his direct role in the brutal beating that led to his wife's tragic death. Instead, under the mounting pressure of the interrogation and the crushing weight of the evidence, the foundation of the defense strategy began to materialize and take formal shape. The narrative strategically pivoted away from a denial of the physical act and plunged deeply into a complex justification of the psychological state that precipitated it. The husband began to articulate a carefully constructed narrative of a profound, catastrophic loss of control, pointing to an apex of marital dispute that had triggered an overwhelming, extreme emotional disturbance. This was a highly calculated and deeply significant legal maneuvering. By openly admitting to the horrifying violence, but simultaneously claiming a temporary, complete fracture of his rational mind, the husband was attempting to legally sever the link between his physical actions and the specific, conscious intent required for a murder conviction in American Samoa. The detectives were forced to meticulously document every nuance of this psychological narrative, recognizing instantly that the primary battleground of the case had just fundamentally shifted from proving who committed the crime to proving the exact, legal nature of the malice that fueled it. The culmination of this intensive, multifaceted investigative phase rested entirely on the shoulders of the prosecuting attorneys, who were now tasked with synthesizing the sprawling, grim data into a cohesive, legally impenetrable narrative suitable for a high-stakes jury trial. They spent countless hours secluded in their offices, reviewing the highly disturbing crime scene photographs, studying the chillingly clinical details of the medical examiner's comprehensive report, and analyzing every recorded syllable of the husband's interrogation transcripts. For the prosecution team, the defense's assertion of an extreme emotional disturbance was viewed as an absolutely unacceptable obfuscation of a clear, deliberate, and undeniably lethal act of domestic violence. They looked at the sustained, protracted nature of the beating, the specific, conscious choice to utilize a whip as a mechanism of control and extreme punishment, and the agonizing, extended duration of the victim's suffering, and they saw a clear, unadulterated manifestation of malice aforethought. The legal threshold for murder in the territory requires a definitive demonstration that the perpetrator acted with a conscious, reckless disregard for human life, a clear realization that their violent actions could reasonably result in death, and a cold decision to proceed with the violence regardless of that realization. The prosecutors argued, with fierce, uncompromising conviction, that the sheer brutality and the continuous, relentless application of extreme physical force inherent in this specific assault fundamentally negated any defense claim of a mere emotional loss of control. They built their entire prosecutorial strategy on the foundational premise that a man who methodically, repeatedly strikes his wife with a weapon until her body systematically ceases to function cannot retroactively claim ignorance of the lethal consequences of his rage. The ultimate decision to bypass lesser charges and pursue the highest possible charge of murder was not merely a strategic legal calculation, it was a profound, deeply symbolic declaration of the intrinsic value of the victim's life. It served as a direct, powerful challenge to any underlying cultural or psychological narrative that sought to excuse, minimize, or explain away the ultimate act of domestic violence. As the investigation officially concluded, the evidence was meticulously sealed, and the January 2017 trial date loomed on the horizon, the prosecution prepared to walk into the historic High Court of American Samoa. They were armed not merely with a vast collection of forensic facts and medical reports, but with a righteous, unwavering demand for ultimate accountability, fully aware that the upcoming legal proceedings would test the moral conscience of the entire territory, setting a precedent that would either reinforce the ultimate sanctity of human life or highlight the devastating, deeply entrenched loopholes within their judicial framework. The month of January in 2017 did not bring the usual sense of renewal to the urban heart of Pago Pago. Instead, it brought a heavy, suffocating stillness that centered entirely on the grand, imposing structure of the High Court of American Samoa. As the trial of the Indigenous husband commenced, the courtroom became a microcosm of a society at a crossroads, a place where the clinical coldness of statutory law collided violently with the messy, heated realities of domestic life and cultural silence. The gallery was packed with observers, their faces a mask of complex emotions ranging from somber curiosity to barely suppressed outrage. The air inside was thick, not just with the tropical humidity that seeped through the vents, but with the palpable weight of a life that had been stolen and the immense responsibility of determining the price of that theft. For the prosecution, the objective was clear and unwavering. They were there to prove that what happened behind those closed doors was not a tragic accident or a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated, sustained, and ultimately murderous act of domestic tyranny. They stood before the BOI Tamdone, the jury of peers, and began the grueling process of translating the horrific physical evidence into a narrative of criminal intent. The prosecution's opening salvos were designed to be as visceral as they were logical. They did not lead with complex legal theories. They led with the physical reality of the victim's final moments. They presented the whip, the primary instrument of the assault, not merely as an object, but as a testament to a specific, repeated choice made by the defendant. The lead prosecutor spoke with a calm but piercing intensity, walking the jury through the timeline of the night, emphasizing the sheer duration of the violence. They argued that murder is often defined by time and the opportunity to stop. Every time the husband raised that whip, every time he drew it back, and every time he brought it down upon his wife's body, he had a moment, a fraction of a second, to recognize the devastation he was causing and to cease his actions. The fact that he did not stop, the prosecution contended, was the very definition of malice aforethought. They brought in medical experts who testified to the catastrophic nature of the injuries, using clinical terms to describe a scene of absolute carnage. The testimony painted a picture of a woman whose body had been systematically broken, whose internal systems had failed under the weight of a relentless assault. This was not a single blow struck in anger, they repeated. This was a campaign of obliculation that could only have one logical conclusion. As the forensic evidence was laid out in agonizing detail, the defense began to construct its counter-narrative, one that would eventually prove to be the most controversial element of the entire proceeding. The husband's legal team did not attempt the impossible task of denying the beating. They conceded the physical acts, acknowledging the horror of the outcome, but they sought to fundamentally reframe the internal state of the man who committed them. Their strategy relied heavily on the concept of extreme emotional disturbance, a legal gateway that allows a jury to consider a defendant's psychological state as a mitigating factor. They argued that the husband was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man who had reached a catastrophic breaking point. They delved into the history of the marital discord, painting a picture of a domestic situation that had become a pressure cooker of tension, resentment, and escalating conflict. The defense suggested that on that fatal night, the husband's rational mind had simply snapped, replaced by a blinding, uncontrollable rage that operated independently of his conscious will. They presented him as a victim of his own volatile emotions, triggered by what they described as intense provocation within the household. This line of defense was a calculated appeal to the jury's understanding of human frailty and the specific pressures of domestic life in American Samoa. By focusing on the husband's psychological fragmentation, the defense attempted to shift the jury's gaze away from the broken body of the wife and toward the internal turmoil of the husband. They argued that he never intended for his wife to die, that in his state of extreme emotional disturbance, he was incapable of forming the specific intent to kill. He was merely lashing out, they claimed, caught in a psychological storm that he neither anticipated nor controlled. The defense lawyers spoke of a man consumed by a temporary madness, an indigenous husband who, in his own distorted reality, was reacting to a family crisis that had stripped him of his reason. They sought to humanize the perpetrator by focusing on his supposed emotional suffering, effectively asking the jury to empathize with the rage that led to the killing rather than the suffering of the woman who died. It was a narrative that prioritized the perpetrator's loss of control over the victim's loss of life. The prosecution fought back with a fierce, indignant energy, recognizing the danger that this psychological defense posed to the pursuit of ultimate justice. They challenged the very idea that emotional disturbance could serve as a shield for such a prolonged and brutal act of violence. They pointed out the inherent contradiction in the defense's argument. How could a man be so out of control that he didn't mean to kill, yet so controlled that he could find a weapon and use it with such terrifying efficiency over an extended period? They argued that the extreme emotional disturbance defense was a loophole being exploited to minimize a clear case of murder. To the prosecution, the nature of the weapon itself, a whip, precluded any claim of a sudden, accidental loss of control. A whip requires distance, it requires a specific motion, and its effects are visible and audible with every strike. They implored the jury to look at the autopsy photos again, to see the marks of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and continued to do it until there was nothing left of his victim. They argued that allowing such a defense to succeed would send a message that domestic violence, if sufficiently brutal and fueled by enough rage, could be legally downgraded to something less than murder. The closing arguments were a study in ideological contrast. The prosecution appealed to the jury's sense of duty to protect the sanctity of life and the rule of law, demanding that the husband be held accountable for the highest possible charge. They spoke for the woman who could no longer speak for herself, asking the jury to be her voice in a system that had already failed to protect her. The defense, conversely, leaned into the complexity of the human heart and the volatility of family disputes, asking for a verdict that acknowledged the husband's supposedly shattered psychological state. The courtroom was a vacuum of tension as the jury finally retired to deliberate. Outside the courthouse, the urban center of Pago Pago seemed to hold its breath. The case had become more than just a trial. It was a referendum on how the territory viewed the lives of women within the home and whether the law would accept anger as an excuse for killing. For several days, the jury wrestled with these conflicting narratives, stuck between the undeniable physical evidence of a brutal death and the psychological justifications offered by the defense. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom in late January 2017, the atmosphere was electric with a dread-filled anticipation. The judge took the verdict forms, and the clerk began to read. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow, not guilty of murder. A collective gasp, a mixture of shock and stifled cries, rippled through the gallery. The BOI Tamdone had accepted the defense's argument, at least enough to find that the prosecution had not proven malicious intent beyond a reasonable doubt. They had instead found the husband guilty of aggravated assault. This was the lesser charge, a felony, yes, but one that carried a fraction of the weight and the stigma of murder. The acquittal on the murder charge was a stunning victory for the defense and a devastating, soul-crushing defeat for the prosecution and those who had hoped for a landmark verdict against domestic violence. The husband, who had faced the prospect of life in prison, was now looking at a sentence that would eventually allow him to return to the community. The legal reality of this verdict was as stark as it was controversial. In the eyes of the law, the jury had decided that the husband's actions, while violent and lethal, did not meet the specific criteria for murder because his state of extreme emotional disturbance had negated his ability to form the necessary intent. By convicting him only of aggravated assault, the jury essentially categorized the death of a wife as a secondary consequence of a physical attack, rather than the intended outcome of a murderous assault. The sentencing phase that followed was a grim postscript to the trial. Because he was only convicted of assault, the judge's hands were tied by the statutory guidelines of the territory. The punishment meted out was significantly lighter than what a murder conviction would have required. The husband was sentenced to a term of years that many in the community felt was an insult to the memory of the victim. It was a sentence that reflected the crime of hitting someone severely, not the crime of taking a life with a whip. The immediate reaction in Pago Pago was one of profound division and burgeoning fury. For the victim's family, the verdict felt like a second killing, a public declaration that their daughters, their sisters, their mother's life was worth less than her husband's excuse for his rage. Women's advocacy groups on the island and across the Pacific expressed absolute horror, realizing that this case set a dangerous precedent. It suggested that if a husband could prove he was sufficiently upset during a fatal beating, he could escape the ultimate consequences of the law. The legal system, designed to provide a fair and impartial adjudication of facts, had instead delivered a result that felt like a betrayal of the most vulnerable. The 2017 verdict didn't just end a trial. It ignited a fire of social activism and legal debate that would consume the territory for years to come. The husband remained an Indigenous man who had killed his wife, but in the official records of American Samoa, he was merely a man who had committed an aggravated assault. This disconnect between the physical truth of the crime and the legal outcome of the trial became the central wound of the case, a wound that Pago Pago would be forced to examine in the light of day as the protests began to form. The final echo of the gavel in the High Court of American Samoa in January 2017 did not bring the expected closure to the urban community of Pago Pago. Instead, the silence that followed the reading of the verdict was heavy, pregnant with a burgeoning sense of collective betrayal and profound societal unease. While the legal proceedings had reached their technical conclusion, the moral and cultural repercussions of the case were only beginning to unfurl across the islands. The acquittal of the Indigenous husband on the charge of murder, replaced by the significantly lesser conviction of aggravated assault, acted as a jagged lightning bolt that illuminated the deepest fractures within the territory's judicial and social frameworks. It was a moment of stark clarity that forced the people of American Samoa to confront a painful reality, that behind the vibrant traditions and the celebrated strength of the family clans, there existed a legal void where the lives of women could be lost to extreme violence without the perpetrator facing the ultimate weight of the law. The verdict was not merely a disappointment to the prosecution. It was a cultural catalyst that stripped away the veneer of communal harmony to reveal a hidden, festering epidemic of domestic abuse that had long been shielded by silence, tradition, and the complex mechanics of the Matai system. In the immediate wake of the trial, the streets of Pago Pago and the surrounding villages became the stage for an unprecedented outpouring of grief and activism. This was no longer a private family matter to be resolved behind the high walls of a traditional enclosure. It had become a public crisis of conscience. The realization that a man could admit to a fatal, prolonged beating with a whip and yet avoid a murder conviction by claiming a temporary psychological fracture sent shockwaves through every layer of society. Women's rights organizations, which had previously operated in the shadows of the dominant patriarchal structure, found their voices amplified by a wave of public fury. They began to organize, to speak out, and to demand that the name of the victim, the wife who had been reduced to a forensic report, be remembered not as a legal casualty, but as a martyr for a necessary revolution. These advocates pointed out the inherent cruelty of the aggravated assault conviction, arguing that such a label was an insult to the sanctity of life. Aggravated assault is a term often associated with street brawls or non-lethal altercations, but when applied to a sustained assault that results in a funeral, it creates a cognitive dissonance that the community found impossible to reconcile. The controversy deeply interrogated the role of the Matai system and the traditional family structures that define Samoan identity. For generations, the Aiga, or extended family, has been the primary source of protection, identity, and justice in the islands. Under the leadership of the Matai, or chiefs, conflicts are often resolved through internal mediation and the ritual of Ifoga, a traditional apology designed to restore peace and prevent intergenerational feuds. However, the 2017 verdict exposed the dark side of this cultural autonomy. Critics began to argue that the emphasis on family honor and the preservation of the clan's reputation often led to the systemic minimization of domestic violence. When a husband's rage is viewed through the lens of family pressure or emotional disturbance, the victim's suffering is frequently sidelined in favor of maintaining the collective status quo. The case in Pago Pago demonstrated that when the law deferentially accepts psychological excuses rooted in domestic stress, it inadvertently bolsters the very walls of silence that keep victims trapped. The traditional expectation that what happens within a family stays within a family was suddenly seen as a death sentence for those living under the threat of violence. This societal awakening led to a fierce and sustained demand for legislative reform. The legal loophole of extreme emotional disturbance became the central target of reformers who argued that it was being weaponized by violent offenders to evade the consequences of murder. There were calls for the FONO, the territorial legislature, to tighten the definitions of domestic homicide and to ensure that the use of weapons or the protracted nature of an assault would automatically preclude any mitigation of the charges. The debate moved from the courtrooms to the community meeting houses as people questioned whether the territory's laws truly reflected the values of a modern society that claims to cherish its women as the backbone of the culture. Advocates argued that true respect for Samoan tradition should involve the absolute protection of the vulnerable, not the provision of excuses for those who violate the sacred bond of the family through brutality. The 2017 case became the primary case study in every argument for change, a grim reminder of what happens when the justice system prioritizes the perpetrator's emotional state over the victim's right to exist. As the months passed, the focus of the reflections inevitably returned to the woman at the center of the tragedy. She had become a symbol, but in that process, there was a risk that her humanity would be lost to the broader political and legal struggle. Those who remembered her outside of the trial spoke of a woman who was part of the fabric of Pago Pago, a wife who navigated the same streets and shared the same cultural hopes as her neighbors. Her death was a solitary, agonizing event, but its aftermath belonged to everyone. The protests were not just about a verdict. They were an act of collective mourning for a woman who had been failed by her husband, her family's silence, and ultimately, her country's laws. The memory of the violence she endured, the whip, the darkness of the room, the isolation of her final hours, served as a haunting presence that refused to let the community return to its previous state of apathy. The urban center of Pago Pago, with its bustling harbor and scenic beauty, now carried the invisible weight of this unresolved grief, a reminder that paradise is hollow if it does not offer safety to those within its homes. The husband's eventual sentencing and his path toward future release remained a point of extreme contention, a lingering wound that prevented the territory from finding true closure. To many, every day he spent in prison was a reminder of the life he took, and every day closer to his release felt like a diminishing of the victim's value. The disparity between the brutality of the crime and the leniency of the sentence became a permanent fixture in the territory's legal discourse. It forced a generation of young Samoans to look at their judicial system with a critical eye, questioning the balance between Western legal concepts of intent and the local cultural realities of domestic life. The case prompted a surge in domestic violence awareness programs as schools, churches, and community groups began to realize that the cycle of violence could only be broken by addressing the root causes of male aggression and the cultural structures that enable it. The tragedy of 2017 became the curriculum for a new way of thinking about gender, power, and accountability in the South Pacific. Looking back from the perspective of years later, the Pago Pago case of 2017 stands as a turning point in the history of American Samoa. It was the moment the silence was finally, irrevocably broken. While the legal verdict cannot be undone, and the husband's charge remains aggravated assault in the official records, the social verdict was far more definitive. The community decided that the excuse of extreme emotional disturbance would no longer be a silent pass for lethal violence. The protests and the subsequent push for reform ensured that the victim's death was not in vain. She became the catalyst for a movement that sought to reclaim the true spirit of the Samoan family, one based on genuine protection and mutual respect rather than the enforced harmony of the Matai system's shadow. The case taught the territory that justice is not just a matter of what happens in a courtroom. It is a continuous, daily commitment to ensuring that no one is ever truly alone behind the doors of their own home. In the quiet hours of the evening in Pago Pago, when the trade winds blow through the palms and the harbor lights twinkle against the dark water, the story of the wife and the whip still lingers in the air. It is a somber narrative, a true crime story that lacks the satisfaction of a traditional ending where the punishment perfectly matches the crime. But in its place, there is a different kind of resolution, a territory that is more awake, a legal system that is under constant scrutiny, and a community that has learned the high cost of looking away. The reflections on this case serve as a permanent vigil for the victim, a promise that her final cry, though unanswered in the moment of her death, has been heard by an entire nation. The legacy of the 2017 trial is a testament to the fact that while laws can be flawed and juries can be swayed, the collective conscience of a people has the power to demand a better, safer future. The wife of Pago Pago remains a silent witness to this ongoing evolution, her story a haunting but necessary guide for a society striving to bridge the gap between its ancient heart and its modern laws, ensuring that the next time a cry for help is raised, the response will be justice, swift and absolute. As we conclude this deep dive into one of American Samoa's most controversial legal chapters, we are left with the image of the islands, beautiful, isolated, and complex. The case of the fatal beating in the urban center of Pago Pago reminds us that true crime is never just about the perpetrator and the victim. It is about the world that allowed the crime to happen and the world that must live with the results. It is a story of a whip and a verdict, but more importantly, it is a story of a silence that was finally shattered. The path to reform is long and the shadows of the old ways are deep, but the light shown by this tragedy continues to guide those who believe that every life is worth more than the anger that ended it. The investigation is over, the trial is finished, but the reflection continues, a steady, calm, and necessary interrogation of what it means to truly protect the ones we claim to love in the heart of the Pacific. The lingering echoes of the January 2017 verdict did not simply vanish into the tropical mist that clings to the volcanic ridges of Tutuila. They settled into the very soil of Pago Pago, becoming a permanent part of the territory's legal and social landscape. To conclude our examination of this harrowing case, we must look at the long-term shadow cast by the High Court's decision and what it reveals about the enduring friction between ancient cultural structures and the modern pursuit of individual justice. The trial of the Indigenous husband was never just a singular event in a vacuum. It was a profound diagnostic of a society's soul. When the jury returned that controversial verdict of aggravated assault instead of murder, they did more than just determine the fate of one man. They inadvertently drew a line in the sand regarding the value of a wife's life when weighed against the volatile emotional state of her husband. This final chapter is not just about the end of a trial, but about the beginning of a different kind of investigation, one that asks how a community can heal from a tragedy that the law itself seemed to minimize, and how the memory of the woman who died can serve as a beacon for a future where such violence is no longer shielded by the excuses of the past. The urban center of Pago Pago today remains a place of stunning contradictions, where the deep blue of the harbor serves as a constant reminder of the island's connection to the vast world beyond, and the rugged mountains represent the fortress-like endurance of Samoan tradition. For the observers who lived through the 2017 trial, the city's geography is now forever marked by the ghosts of the case. The High Court building stands as a monument to a moment when the legal system was tested and, in the eyes of many, found wanting. The conviction of aggravated assault remains a point of deep intellectual and emotional agony for the advocates of domestic violence reform. In the hierarchy of crimes, an assault is a violation of the body, but a murder is a violation of the soul and the ultimate theft of a future. By categorizing the fatal beating of a wife with a whip as an assault, the judicial system in 2017 signaled a terrifying possibility that in the eyes of the law, the fatal outcome was secondary to the perpetrator's internal emotional turbulence. This legal distinction created a wound in the community's sense of safety that is not yet fully closed. We must reflect deeply on the mechanics of the defense that succeeded in this courtroom. The concept of extreme emotional disturbance is a complex legal tool designed to account for the fragility of the human mind under immense stress. However, in the context of the Pago Pago case, its application felt to many like a betrayal of the victim's humanity. The defense argued that the husband's rage was a force of nature, a psychological storm that he could not navigate, thereby reducing him from a deliberate actor to a passive observer of his own violence. But this narrative conveniently ignores the physical reality of the incident. A whip is not a weapon of sudden, reflexive impulse. It is a tool that requires repeated, sustained exertion. Each strike was a choice, yet the verdict of aggravated assault suggested that these choices were somehow negated by the defendant's emotional state. This sets a dangerous precedent in a territory where domestic disputes are often intense and deeply entangled with family honor. If the law allows anger to act as a mitigating factor for lethal violence, it essentially provides a roadmap for future perpetrators to claim a loss of control as a shield against the ultimate penalty. The role of the Matai system in the aftermath of this case cannot be overstated. American Samoa's unique strength lies in its preservation of these traditional clan structures, which provide a sense of belonging and social order that is often missing in more individualistic Western societies. Yet, the 2017 case spared the sharp, painful edges of this system. The pressure to maintain family harmony and the cultural habit of resolving disputes internally created an environment where the victim's suffering was invisible until it was too late. The verdict reflected a societal reluctance to fully pierce the veil of the home with the sharp needle of statutory law. When the jury chose the lesser charge, they were, in a sense, echoing a cultural sentiment that family tragedies are messy, emotional, and perhaps not entirely subject to the cold, hard logic of a murder conviction. This case forced a confrontation between the traditional way of life, which often seeks reconciliation, and the preservation of the family unit at all costs, and the modern legal requirement for individual accountability. It asked whether a society can truly be just if it allows the sanctity of the domestic sphere to become a graveyard for the vulnerable. The legacy of the victim, the wife whose name was replaced by a legal status, has become the foundation for a new era of advocacy in American Samoa. In the years since the 2017 verdict, the silence that once characterized domestic violence on the islands has begun to break. The outrage sparked by the aggravated assault conviction acted as a powerful propellant for women's rights organizations and legal reformers. They have utilized the grim details of this case, the whip, the prolonged assault, the acquittal on murder, to illustrate the urgent need for a systematic overhaul of how the territory handles domestic abuse. There has been a push to redefine the legal standards for intent in domestic homicide cases, ensuring that the emotional disturbance defense cannot be used to justify the systematic destruction of a human life. The victim's story has become a tool for education, a way to show young Samoans that true strength does not lie in the physical dominance of a spouse, but in the protection of the family's most vulnerable members. Her death, while a profound tragedy, has been transformed by the community into a catalyst for a safer, more transparent society. As we look at the broader implications for the Pacific region, the Pago Pago case serves as a cautionary tale for any society balancing tradition with the rule of law. It highlights the vulnerability of the judicial system when it is asked to mediate between deeply held cultural beliefs and the universal right to safety. The 2017 trial proved that the law is not just a collection of statutes, it is a reflection of a community's priorities. If a community prioritizes the emotional excuses of a perpetrator over the life of a victim, its laws will reflect that imbalance. The protests and the legislative debates that followed the verdict were the community's way of attempting to rebalance those scales. It was a declaration that the islands of American Samoa are no longer willing to accept the dark side of their clan systems as an inevitable price of their culture. The case has spurred a move toward a more rigorous, uncompromising stance on domestic violence, one that refuses to look away even when the violence happens behind the closed doors of a respected family. The husband, the perpetrator of this catastrophic violence, remains a figure of profound controversy. His conviction for aggravated assault meant that he would eventually return to the society he had so violently disrupted. This reality is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the case for the community to process. The idea that a man who used a whip to take his wife's life could walk the same streets as her family after a relatively short period of incarceration is a source of ongoing trauma. It serves as a constant reminder of the gap between the moral gravity of the crime and the legal outcome of the trial. His existence in the post-trial world is a living testament to the limitations of the justice system as it existed in January 2017. He is a man who is saved by a psychological defense, but in the court of public opinion, the verdict against him remains much harsher than the one delivered by the BOI Tam Doan. In the final analysis, the story of the 2017 Pago Pago case is a story of a silence that was shattered by a whip and then challenged by a community's voice. It is a story that begins in the private darkness of a home and ends in the public light of a movement for reform. The victim, the wife, did not have the chance to see the change her death would bring, but her presence is felt in every new law proposed and every awareness campaign launched. She is the silent witness to the evolution of her territory. The lush, volcanic landscape of American Samoa, with its deep harbors and ancient traditions, continues to be a place of beauty, but it is now a beauty that is being refined by a harder, more honest look at the realities of human rights within the home. The pursuit of justice in this case did not end with the verdict. It continues every day that a Samoan woman speaks out, every day that a Matai refuses to ignore abuse, and every day that the law is used to protect rather than to excuse. As the sun sets over the Pago Pago harbor, casting long shadows across the water, we are reminded that the deep blue of the Pacific holds many stories of loss and resilience. The case of the wife and the indigenous husband is one of the most painful of these stories, a narrative that exposes the fragility of life and the complexity of the law. But it is also a story of a society that refused to stay silent after the gavel fell. The 2017 trial was a moment of failure that sparked a decade of effort to do better. It reminds us that justice is not a static destination reached at the end of a trial, but a continuous journey of a people striving to honor the memory of the lost by protecting the living. The victim's final legacy is not the violence she endured, but the courage she has inspired in others to ensure that her tragedy is the last of its kind. We leave this case with a sense of solemnity and a renewed understanding that the walls of the home must never again be thick enough to drown out the cry for help, and the law must never again be blind enough to call the end of a life anything less than what it truly is. The investigation into the soul of Pago Pago continues, guided by the light of a life that was taken too soon, but whose impact will be felt for generations to come. The harbor remains quiet, the mountains remain tall, and the memory of the 2017 case remains a vital, unyielding part of the story of American Samoa, a story that is still being written with every step toward a more just and safe future for all. As the calendar turns toward the midpoint of 2026, nearly a decade has passed since the heavy doors of the High Court of American Samoa swung shut on the case that redefined a generation's understanding of justice in the South Pacific. The tropical sun continues to rise over the jagged green peaks of Tutuila, and the waters of Pago Pago harbor still reflect the shifting moods of the sky, yet the air in the urban center remains charged with the invisible weight of the 2017 verdict. For those who lived through the trial, and for the new generation of advocates who have come of age in its shadow, the story of the wife and the whip is not a distant memory, but a living, breathing part of the territory's ongoing moral struggle. We look back now from the perspective of May 2026, and we are forced to ask whether the shockwaves of that January morning have finally settled into a foundation for meaningful change, or if they have merely become a quiet, recurring ache in the collective conscience of the islands. The passage of time has a way of smoothing over the sharp edges of a tragedy, turning a brutal crime into a historical footnote, but the sheer gravity of this specific case has resisted such erasure. It remains a singular point of reference, a moment where the law, the culture, and the human heart collided with such force that the fragments are still being gathered today. The legal landscape of American Samoa in 2026 bears the undeniable scars of the 2017 proceedings. The acquittal of the husband on murder charges and his conviction on the lesser count of aggravated assault became the primary catalyst for a decade-long interrogation of the territory's criminal code. This case exposed a fundamental vulnerability in how the law defined lethal intent within the domestic sphere. For years following the verdict, the legal community and social reformers engaged in a fierce, often polarizing debate over the extreme emotional disturbance defense. Critics argued that this legal mechanism, as applied in 2017, essentially sanctioned a crime of passion loophole that allowed perpetrators of sustained, methodical violence to escape the ultimate accountability for taking a life. By 2026, this debate has pushed the FONO and the territorial judiciary toward a more nuanced, perhaps more stringent, application of such defenses. There has been a growing movement to ensure that the duration and brutality of an assault, specifically the use of weapons like a whip, should act as a disqualifier for any claim of temporary loss of control. The legacy of the 2017 case is found in the way modern prosecutors now approach domestic homicide, armed with a deeper understanding of how to counter psychological justifications with the cold, hard reality of physical forensics. However, the legal shifts are only one part of the story. The true impact of the case is felt in the shifting dynamics of the Matai system and the traditional family structures that form the backbone of Samoan life. In 2026, the conversation about domestic violence has moved from the shadows into the center of the communal meeting house. The old mandate of silence, which once dictated that family disputes be resolved behind closed doors to protect the clan's honor, has been fundamentally challenged. The tragedy of the wife in Pago Pago proved that the price of such silence is often a human life. Today, there is a visible, if gradual, shift toward transparency. Younger Matais and family leaders are increasingly vocal about the responsibility of the clan to protect its members from internal predators, rather than just shielding the family name from external judgment. The 2017 verdict served as a painful lesson that a culture which prioritizes honor over safety is a culture that leaves its most vulnerable members behind. The memory of the woman who died under the whip has become a silent participant in these traditional councils, a reminder that the true strength of an Aga is measured by the safety of its women, not the silence of its victims. The urban sector of Pago Pago itself has evolved, but it remains a place where the proximity of the community creates a unique kind of social pressure. To walk the streets of the capital in 2026 is to walk through a geography of remembrance. There are no statues for the victim, no plaques commemorating the 2017 trial, but the story is woven into the oral history of the harbor. It is discussed in the local markets, whispered in the back of buses, and analyzed in the university classrooms. The case has become a touchstone for true crime podcasts and investigative journalists across the globe who look to American Samoa as a microcosm of the universal struggle to reconcile ancient customs with modern human rights. This global attention has acted as both a burden and a blessing for the territory. It has brought a sense of scrutiny that some find intrusive, but has also ensured that the case cannot be swept under the rug. The international lens on Pago Pago has helped sustain the momentum for reform, reminding the local government that the world is watching how they value the lives of their citizens within the home. We must also consider the husband, the man whose rage and subsequent legal victory define this narrative. By 2026, the sentence for aggravated assault has likely run its course, or is nearing its end. His return to the community, or his continued presence within it, is a source of profound, quiet tension. He remains a living symbol of the gap between the moral reality of a crime and the legal outcome of a trial. His existence in the post-trial world is a constant test of the community's capacity for forgiveness and its commitment to vigilance. For some, his freedom is an ongoing insult to the memory of his wife. For others, it is a reminder of the fallibility of a jury system that allowed itself to be swayed by a narrative of emotional disturbance. Regardless of where he is now, he cannot escape the shadow of 2017. He is a man whose name will forever be linked to a whip and a verdict that many believe failed to meet the demands of justice. His life is a testament to the fact that while the law may grant a person a second chance, the community's memory is not so easily partitioned. As we reach the final moments of this investigation, our focus must return, as it always does, to the woman whose life was the price of this collective awakening. In the years since 2017, she has been reclaimed from the sterile language of the court documents. She is no longer just the wife, or the victim in the eyes of those who carry her story forward. She has become a symbol of the silent endurance of countless women who navigate the complex intersections of tradition and violence every day. Her death was a moment of profound, isolated terror, but her legacy is a loud, communal demand for change. When we listen to these stories, we are not just engaging in a morbid curiosity. We are participating in an act of witnessing. We are ensuring that the darkness of that night in Pago Pago is met with the light of public scrutiny and the warmth of human empathy. We are acknowledging that every strike of that whip was a strike against the very idea of a safe society, and every minute she spent in that room was a minute the world failed her. The pursuit of justice is a marathon, not a sprint, and in American Samoa, that marathon continues into 2026. The 2017 case was a devastating hurdle, a moment where the system seemed to stumble and lose its way. But the response to that failure has been a renewed, fierce determination to build something better. The islands are still beautiful, the culture is still rich, and the families are still strong, but there is a new, hard-won honesty in how they face their internal demons. The legal reforms, the social activism, and the cultural shifts all point toward a future where the next woman who finds herself in danger will not be met with silence, but with the full, unyielding protection of her family and her law. The harbor of Pago Pago, which has seen so much history pass through its waters, now carries this story as a warning and a guide. It is a narrative of a life lost, a verdict that fell short, and a community that refused to let the story end there. In the final accounting, we must ask ourselves what we have learned from the 2017 trial. We have learned that intent is a fragile, easily manipulated concept in the hands of a skilled defense. We have learned that emotion can be a dangerous shield for cruelty. We have learned that tradition is only as valuable as the lives it protects. But most importantly, we have learned that the story of a single, nameless wife in a small island territory can resonate across oceans and years, forcing us all to look at our own systems of justice and ask if we are doing enough. The case of the Indigenous husband and his wife in Pago Pago is a tragedy of the highest order, but it is also a testament to the power of a community to demand more from its laws. As the trade winds blow through the urban center of Pago Pago today, they carry the echoes of that January morning, a reminder that the work of justice is never truly finished. It is a constant, daily effort to bridge the gap between who we are and who we claim to be. The recording ends here, but the reflection must continue. True crime is not just about the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. As we look into the mirror of the 2017 Pago Pago case, we see a society in transition, a territory wrestling with its identity, and a woman whose memory demands that we never look away again. The harbor is quiet now. The mountains are draped in the soft light of the evening, and the story of the wife who died under the whip remains a haunting, vital part of the soul of American Samoa. It is a story that began in violence and ended in a verdict that shocked the world, but its final chapter is still being written by those who believe that every life is worth the ultimate pursuit of justice. We leave Pago Pago with a heavy heart, but with a renewed commitment to the idea that the silence of the past is no match for the voices of the future. The investigation into the 2017 case is complete, but the vigil for the victim, and for all those she represents, will never truly end. This is the weight of history, the cost of justice, and the enduring power of a life that refused to be forgotten. May her memory be a shield for the vulnerable and a fire for the reformers, now and for all the years to come in the heart of the Pacific. As we stand in the present moment of May 2026, looking back across the nearly 10-year span since that fateful January in 2017, we are forced to acknowledge that some cases never truly end. They do not conclude with the final signature on a sentencing document or the quiet closing of a court file. Instead, they remain alive, vibrating within the collective memory of a community, surfacing in every new headline about domestic strife and every new debate about the fairness of the law. The case of the Indigenous husband and his wife in Pago Pago has become exactly that, a permanent, haunting fixture in the cultural and legal landscape of American Samoa. It is a story that has transcended its original borders, serving as a chilling case study for legal experts and social activists around the world who seek to understand the dangerous intersections of traditional culture and modern jurisprudence. In this final deep dive into the narrative, we must move beyond the facts of the trial and the mechanics of the assault to examine the profound, lingering psychological state of a territory that is still trying to reconcile a brutal reality with a controversial verdict. The harbor of Pago Pago, which seen the arrival of missionaries, the construction of naval bases, and the ebb and flow of global trade, now carries the invisible weight of a different kind of history, a history of a silence that was broken too late and a justice that many believe was never fully served. To understand the 2026 perspective on this tragedy, one must first confront the absolute, uncompromising nature of the extreme emotional disturbance, defense that effectively dismantled the prosecution's murder case. This legal maneuver, while theoretically sound within the confines of a courtroom, has become the most enduring point of pain for the people of American Samoa. It suggests that there is a threshold of anger, a peak of domestic frustration, that can somehow transform a lethal, methodical beating into a lesser crime of passion. In the years following 2017, this concept has been interrogated with renewed ferocity. Legal scholars in the territory have pointed out that the defense relied on a very specific, and perhaps biased, interpretation of Samoan domestic life. It painted a picture of a man pushed to the brink by familial conflict, a narrative that subtly asked the jury to sympathize with the perpetrator's loss of control rather than the victim's loss of life. By 2026, this has sparked a profound shift in the way juries are instructed in American Samoa. There is now a much more rigorous demand for proof of such emotional disturbance, and a growing recognition that the sheer brutality of using a whip, a weapon that requires time, space, and repetitive intent should, by its very nature, negate any claim of a sudden, reflexive psychological fracture. The 2017 verdict served as the catalyst for this judicial hardening, a never-again moment that has shaped every domestic homicide trial in the decade since. The sociological butterfly effect of the 2017 verdict has also fundamentally altered the internal dynamics of the Matai system, the traditional backbone of the islands. In the past, the Matai system functioned as a shield, often internalizing family tragedies and prioritizing the preservation of communal harmony over the individual rights of the battered. But the case of the wife in Pago Pago proved that this shield could also be a shroud. The public outrage that followed the aggravated assault conviction broke the seal of traditional privacy in a way that had never been seen before. Today, in 2026, the Matai system is undergoing a quiet but powerful modernization. Younger family leaders, many of whom were students or young adults during the 2017 trial, are reclaiming the original spirit of the Matai role, that of a protector rather than a silencer. The idea that a family dispute is a private matter is being replaced by the understanding that violence against any member of the clan is a violation of the entire Aga's honor. The 2017 case provided the grim evidence that was needed to convince the elders that the old ways of handling domestic strife were no longer sufficient in a world where the stakes are measured in human lives. Furthermore, we must consider the atmosphere of Pago Pago itself as a character in this long-term reflection. The urbanized sectors of the capital are not just locations of commerce and government. They are the physical stages where the memory of the 2017 case is enacted daily. The proximity of life in American Samoa means that everyone is connected to the tragedy in some way, through family ties, church congregations, or simply by walking the same streets as the victim and her husband. This proximity has created a unique kind of social vigilance. In 2026, there is a heightened awareness of the signs of domestic abuse that was absent a decade ago. Neighbors are more likely to intervene, families are more likely to speak up, and the police department has seen a significant increase in the reporting of domestic incidents. The tragedy of the wife who died under the whip has, in a painful way, become a guardian for the women who came after her. Her story is used as a warning in community workshops and as a rallying cry for the social services that have been expanded across the territory. The urban landscape of Pago Pago, while still beautiful and serene, is now a place where the community's eyes are wide open. The husband, who in the eyes of the law in 2017 was a man who committed an assault rather than a murder, remains the most polarizing figure in the territory's modern history. His existence within the post-verdict world is a constant test of the limits of legal redemption versus moral accountability. While he may have served the time required by his sentence, the sentence imposed by the community is far more permanent. In 2026, his story is taught as a lesson in the fallibility of the justice system. He represents the man who found a loophole in the law, a man whose rage was legally excused by a jury of his peers. His presence, or even the memory of his presence, serves as an uncomfortable reminder that the law and justice are not always synonymous. This disconnect has led to a decade of intense activism aimed at ensuring that the definition of aggravated assault can never again be used to describe a fatal beating. The legacy of the husband is not one of a man who is acquitted, but of a man who exposed the cracks in the foundation of the territory's judicial house, cracks that the people have been working tirelessly to fill ever since. Reflecting on the victim, the wife, we find that her silence has become the most powerful voice in American Samoa. In 2017, she was a silhouette in a court document, a body in an autopsy report, a woman whose agency had been stolen by violence and then further diminished by a legal downgrading of her death. But by 2026, she has been reconstructed in the public consciousness as a figure of immense symbolic importance. She is no longer just a victim of domestic violence. She is the woman who changed the law. She is the reason that protective orders are now easier to obtain, the reason that domestic violence shelters have seen increased funding, and the reason that the FONO has passed more stringent sentencing guidelines for repeat offenders of domestic abuse. Her life, though cut short with such unimaginable cruelty, has attained a kind of immortality through the reforms she inspired. Every woman who finds safety in a shelter or receives justice in a courtroom today is, in some small way, a part of her enduring legacy. As we bring this long-form narrative to its ultimate conclusion, we are left with a final, somber thought about the nature of true crime and its impact on society. The case of the 2017 Pago Pago assault is a reminder that justice is not a destination, but a continuous, often painful process of self-correction. The verdict was a failure, but the reaction to that verdict was a triumph of the human spirit. It proved that a community can take its grief and its fury and turn them into a force for systemic change. The islands of American Samoa are still wrestling with the shadows of the past, but they are no longer afraid to shine a light into the darkest corners of their homes. The harbor of Pago Pago, with its deep, sheltered waters, continues to protect the territory from the storms of the Pacific, but the community has learned that the greatest storms are often the ones that brew within. The story of the wife and the whip is a narrative of absolute tragedy, but its final chapter, written in 2026, is one of hope and hard-won resilience. It tells us that while we cannot change the past, we are not doomed to repeat it. It tells us that the value of a life is not determined by a jury's verdict, but by the legacy that life leaves behind. And it tells us that even in the most isolated corners of the world, the pursuit of justice is a universal flame that can never be fully extinguished. As the sun sets on Tutuila today, the memory of the woman who died in 2017 remains a vital part of the island's story, a story of a people who learned that the only way to truly honor the dead is to fiercely protect the living. The investigation is finally closed, the verdict has been analyzed, and the aftermath has been chronicled. All that remains is the ongoing work of justice, a work that began with a cry in the night and continues with a promise of a safer, more transparent future for every family in American Samoa. May her name, though unspoken in the court, be forever etched in the hearts of those who continue to fight for the truth. This is the final word on Pago Pago, a story of violence, a story of a verdict, and ultimately, a story of a territory that refused to stay silent. The passage of nearly a decade since that transformative January in 2017 has not dulled the sharp edges of the questions that still haunt the High Court and the family enclosures of American Samoa. As we reach the final movement of this narrative in May 2026, the case of the husband and the wife in Pago Pago stands less as a closed chapter and more as an open wound in the territory's legal consciousness. It serves as a stark, unyielding reminder of the delicate and often dangerous friction that exists when the rigid structures of Western law are superimposed onto a society governed by the deep, ancient rhythms of the Matai system. To conclude this investigation, we must look beyond the verdict and the sentencing to the very soul of justice itself, asking what it means for a community to witness the ultimate act of domestic violence and see it translated by the courts into a crime of assault rather than the taking of a life. The urban landscape of Pago Pago, with its bustling docks and verdant hillsides, continues to move forward, but the story of the woman who died under the whip remains a permanent part of the island's atmospheric pressure, a weight that is felt by every lawyer, every advocate, and every family member who dares to look closely at the cracks in their own sanctuary. The enduring controversy of the 2017 verdict lies in the profound linguistic and moral gap between the act committed and the label the law ultimately assigned to it. When the jury returned a conviction of aggravated assault, they were operating within a specific, narrow legal framework that prioritizes the psychological state of the perpetrator over the physical outcome for the victim. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect for the public to reconcile. In the common understanding of humanity, if a man beats his wife with a whip until her body fails and her heart stops, that act is murder. It is the intentional, or, at the very least, the recklessly indifferent destruction of a human life. Yet, the legal defense of extreme emotional disturbance allowed the jury to pivot their focus. They were invited to look into the mind of the indigenous husband, to see a man overwhelmed by the pressures of a failing marriage and a peak of family conflict, and to conclude that his rage was a force that bypassed his rational intent. By 2026, this case has become the primary example used by reformers to argue that the law must be changed to ensure that the sheer brutality of an act, the use of a weapon, the duration of the violence, the intensity of the trauma, should inherently define the crime, regardless of the emotional state of the attacker. This case forced an entire territory to confront the double-edged sword of the Matai system. For centuries, the Faa Samoa, the Samoan way of life, has provided a profound sense of communal identity and social stability. The family clans are the fortress of the culture, and the chiefs are the arbiters of peace. But the 2017 trial exposed a dark, hidden corridor within that fortress. It showed how the cultural emphasis on family honor and the internal resolution of disputes can inadvertently create a vacuum where the law of the land is slow to enter. The victim in this case lived and died in an urban center, but she was trapped in a cultural silence that was as old as the islands themselves. The realization that her suffering was allowed to reach its fatal conclusion because of a societal reluctance to breach the walls of the domestic space has sparked a slow, painful revolution in Samoan social dynamics. By 2026, the conversation has shifted. There is a growing consensus that the preservation of family honor cannot come at the cost of a family member's life. The tragedy of the wife in Pago Pago has become the catalyst for a new kind of bravery, where neighbors and Matais are increasingly willing to choose individual safety over communal silence. The legislative ripple effects of this case continue to be felt in the Fono, the territorial legislature, where lawmakers have spent the last several years debating the limits of the extreme emotional disturbance defense. The 2017 verdict proved that the law, as it was written, contained a loophole that could be exploited to minimize the most extreme forms of domestic violence. Advocates have pushed for a duty to retreat, or a reasonable person standard that would prevent a perpetrator from claiming a loss of control in situations where they were the primary aggressor. They argue that the justice system must send a clear, unambiguous message that no amount of marital discord or family pressure can ever serve as a legal shield for the use of a whip or the infliction of lethal force. This legislative struggle is the direct descendant of the grief and fury felt in the streets of Pago Pago after the acquittal on the murder charge. It is a slow, grinding process of legal evolution, fueled by the memory of a woman whose death was not granted the dignity of a murder conviction in her own time. Reflecting on the victim, we must acknowledge the profound injustice of her anonymity. Throughout the legal process and the subsequent years of public debate, she has often been reduced to a symbol or a set of medical findings. But she was a woman of the islands, a person who lived within the urban pulse of Pago Pago, who likely had dreams and fears that had nothing to do with the violence that ended her life. In 2026, her legacy is found not in the court records, but in the changed lives of the women who now have access to better shelters, more responsive police, and a community that is no longer content to look the other way. Her story has become a haunting, necessary guide for a society that is trying to do better. She represents the thousands of silent victims who walked before her and the promise of a safer future for those who will walk after her. The true measure of the justice she received is not found in the sentence handed down to her husband, but in the enduring commitment of her people to ensure that her tragedy is never repeated. The husband, too, remains a part of the story, a man whose life was forever altered by his own rage and the legal mercy he was shown. His return to the community, or his continued presence in the public consciousness, is a constant, uncomfortable test of the territory's moral framework. He is a living reminder of the fallibility of human judgment and the limitations of the courtroom. His case teaches us that the law can be followed to the letter and still fail to provide a sense of true resolution. For many in Pago Pago, his freedom is a recurring sting, a reminder of the night the system chose to empathize with the abuser rather than the abused. This tension is the price a society pays for a verdict that feels disconnected from the physical reality of the crime. It ensures that the case remains a focal point of debate, a scar that refuses to fade, forcing every new generation of legal professionals in American Samoa to grapple with the definition of malice and the requirements of accountability. As we conclude this long-form reflection, we are left with the image of Pago Pago Harbor at twilight, the deep waters reflecting the last of the sun's gold before the Pacific night takes over. This harbor has witnessed the entire history of the islands, and it now carries the story of the 2017 trial in its depths. It is a story of a whip, a verdict, and a community that found its voice too late for one woman, but perhaps in time for many others. True crime is often a narrative of the worst human impulses, but in its aftermath, it can also be a narrative of the best. The response to the Pago Pago case, the protests, the reforms, the cultural awakening, is a testament to the resilience and the moral clarity of the people of American Samoa. They took a moment of profound judicial failure and used it to build a more transparent and protective society. The investigation into the 2017 tragedy is finally over, but the vigil for the victim continues. Her life was taken in a closed room in an urban sector of the capital, but her impact has reached every corner of the islands. As the trade winds blow through the palms and the urban center of Pago Pago prepares for another night, there is a sense that the silence is no longer as heavy as it once was. The story of the wife who died has become a permanent part of the island's light, a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. We leave this story with a deep sense of empathy for the woman who was lost and a profound respect for the community that refused to let her death be the final word. The pursuit of justice in American Samoa is an ongoing journey, a path that is still being paved by those who remember January 2017 and who believe that the law can and must do more. The harbor is calm, the mountains are silent, but the heartbeat of this case continues to pulse through the territory, a steady, unyielding demand for a future where every home is a sanctuary and every life is sacred. This is the ultimate legacy of the Pago Pago case, a tragedy that became a turning point, a silence that became a roar, and a victim whose memory has finally and permanently broken the walls of the hidden clans. In the end, the story of the 2017 case is the story of a people choosing to see the truth, no matter how painful, and to walk toward the light of a more just and safe tomorrow. The morning of May 19, 2026, unfolds over the harbor of Pago Pago with a characteristic tropical humidity that seems to hold the history of the island in its very breath. From the vantage point of the green slopes of Tutuila, the urban center looks much as it did a decade ago, a collection of administrative buildings, commercial storefronts, and family residences clustered around the deep, blue water that has sustained this territory for centuries. Yet, for the people of American Samoa, the tranquility of this May morning is a veneer that covers a landscape fundamentally altered by the legal and moral earthquake of 2017. As we reach this 11th chapter of our deep dive into the case of the husband and the wife, we find ourselves at a critical juncture of reflection. This is no longer just a true crime story about a brutal assault and a controversial verdict. It has become a foundational text for the territory's modern identity. To walk through Pago Pago today is to walk through a community that is still, nearly 10 years later, processing the shock of hearing a court declare that a fatal beating with a whip could be legally categorized as something less than murder. This enduring tension remains the central pulse of the territory's social discourse, a haunting reminder that the pursuit of justice is a road with no final destination, only a series of milestones marked by grief, reform, and a persistent demand for the truth. The primary conflict that continues to agitate the legal and social consciousness of American Samoa in 2026 is the profound, irreducible gap between the physical reality of the 2017 incident and the legal terminology used to resolve it. In the clinical environment of the High Court, the term aggravated assault was used to describe a sequence of events that resulted in a funeral. For the layperson, for the families of the victims, and for the advocates of human rights, this term feels like a linguistic mask, a way for the law to avoid the terrifying finality of what actually occurred. The evidence showed a wife who was subjected to a prolonged, methodical application of violence, a husband who chose a weapon and utilized it with devastating repetition, and a biological system that eventually collapsed under the weight of trauma. In any common understanding of morality, this is the definition of a life taken by another. However, the legal acceptance of the extreme emotional disturbance defense created a reality where the law looked at a corpse and saw only a battery. This disconnect has become the defining scar of the case, a source of ongoing trauma for a community that expects its judicial system to reflect its moral reality. In the years since, the struggle to reconcile the legal truth with the physical truth has fueled a generation of activists who refuse to let the 2017 verdict be the final word on the value of a woman's life in the islands. In May of 2026, the Matai system, the traditional bedrock of Samoan society, finds itself in a state of profound, self-reflective evolution, largely due to the shadows cast by this specific case. For centuries, the clans have operated as a parallel structure to the territorial government, providing a sense of order and collective responsibility that predates the arrival of Western legal codes. But the 2017 trial acted as a high-pressure diagnostic tool, exposing the ways in which this system could be used to shield perpetrators and silence the suffering of the vulnerable. The realization that the husband's defense subtly appealed to traditional understandings of domestic stress and family conflict was a wake-up call for many tribal leaders. Today, the conversation in the village councils has shifted from the preservation of family honor to the active protection of individual rights. There is a growing recognition that true honor lies in the safety of the Aga's members, and that a chief's primary duty is to ensure that the home is a sanctuary, not a cage. This cultural shift, while slow and sometimes met with resistance from the older guard, is the most significant long-term legacy of the tragedy. It represents a move toward a more transparent and accountable form of traditional leadership, one that no longer views domestic violence as a private matter to be hidden behind the walls of the clan. The legislative atmosphere in American Samoa today is also a direct reflection of the outrage that followed the January 2017 verdict. The Fono has spent the better part of a decade grappling with the fallout of the aggravated assault conviction, working to close the loopholes that allowed such a violent act to be downgraded in the eyes of the law. The debate over the extreme emotional disturbance defense has moved from the courtroom to the halls of government, where lawmakers are under constant pressure to ensure that the psychological state of an abuser can never again be used to justify the systematic destruction of a life. There is a sense in 2026 that the legal threshold for murder must be redefined to include the sheer brutality of the act itself as primary evidence of intent. The case of the wife and the whip is cited in nearly every legislative session dealing with criminal justice, serving as a grim reminder of what happens when the law allows for a mitigation of the ultimate crime. These legislative efforts are the community's way of retroactively seeking justice for the victim, a collective attempt to ensure that the legal failure of 2017 is never repeated for another daughter of the islands. When we consider the victim herself, we must acknowledge that in 2026, she has achieved a kind of immortality that she never sought. She has become the silent conscience of Pago Pago, her absence a constant presence in the territory's struggle for reform. In the early days after the trial, she was a figure of pity, a victim of a system that failed her twice, first in her home and then in the courtroom. But over the last 10 years, her image has been transformed into one of resilience and catalyst. She is the reason that domestic violence shelters in American Samoa are now better funded and more accessible. She is the reason that police training now includes a much more comprehensive understanding of the dynamics of coercive control and the lethality of physical abuse. Her life was tragically short, but its impact has been exponentially long. Every time a protective order is granted, or a victim is empowered to speak out against a powerful family member, the spirit of the woman from the 2017 case is there. She has become the beacon for a new era of safety, her story a haunting but necessary guide for a society that is finally learning to listen to the cries that were once ignored. The husband's role in the social narrative of 2026 is one of enduring controversy and localized discomfort. As the legal consequences of his actions have faded into the past, the social consequences have remained as sharp as ever. His existence in the community, or the legacy of his acquittal on the murder charge, serves as a constant test of the territory's ability to move forward. He represents a legal anomaly, a man who walked through the highest level of violence and emerged with a sentence that many feel did not match the gravity of the deed. This tension is a permanent feature of life in a small island society where everyone knows the story and no one forgets the blood. His case has become a cautionary tale for the judicial system, a reminder that a verdict which alienates the public's sense of justice can have a corrosive effect on the community's trust in the law. In 2026, he is less an individual and more a symbol of the work that still needs to be done to ensure that the law is a tool for the protection of the victim, rather than a shield for the perpetrator. The global perspective on this case has also intensified as we reach the midpoint of the decade. American Samoa is often looked at as a microcosm of the global struggle between indigenous custom and international human rights standards. The 2017 case has been analyzed by international observers as a prime example of how local cultural defenses can be manipulated to undermine the protection of women. This outside scrutiny has served as a powerful motivator for local reformers who are determined to show the world that Samoan culture is not synonymous with the acceptance of violence. The 2026 perspective is one of a territory that is increasingly confident in its ability to synthesize its ancient traditions with a modern, uncompromising stance on human rights. The tragedy of Pago Pago has become a bridge to a more globally connected and ethically rigorous future, ensuring that the lessons learned on this small island resonate far across the Pacific. As the sun continues its path across the sky on this May morning, we are left with a final, somber reflection on the nature of memory and justice. The case of the 2017 assault is a reminder that the most important verdicts are not always delivered by a jury, but by the community that must live with the results. The people of American Samoa have delivered their own verdict over the last 10 years, a verdict of never again. They have chosen to remember the victim not as a nameless silhouette, but as a catalyst for a more just society. They have chosen to challenge the silence of the clans and the limitations of the court. And they have chosen to believe that, even in the face of a profound legal failure, there is always the opportunity to build a safer tomorrow. The harbor of Pago Pago remains as deep and as blue as it has always been, but it now carries the weight of a story that has changed the territory forever. The investigation into the 2017 case is a journey that has no end, because the work of protecting the vulnerable is a task that must be renewed every day. We leave this narrative with a sense of solemnity, but also with a sense of hope, a hope that is rooted in the courage of a people who saw the darkness of that night in 2017 and decided to walk together toward the light. The story of the wife and the whip is a tragedy, yes, but its ending is still being written by the hands of those who demand that justice be as vast as the ocean and as enduring as the mountains of Tutuila. The silence is broken, the voices are rising, and the memory of the woman who was lost continues to guide the way for all who seek a future defined by peace, safety, and the absolute sanctity of every human life. This is the enduring legacy of Pago Pago, a story that began in violence but continues in the pursuit of a higher truth.